How's things, John? You're very welcome back.
Very, very good, John. Thanks for having me back. Looking forward to speaking to you again.
Nice one. Last book. Oh, sorry. We'll say the last episode. Easily one of my favorite. It's the main episode is on nearly 70. Or sorry, yeah, nearly 70K views on YouTube, and with the clip, then that was like another 30, so like 100. Unreal for a niche topic, and for someone who's not writing about like their own. Now, obviously, you were in East Tyrone for a bit, but for someone not writing about their own experiences.
I'm absolutely over the moon about it, and I think to be fair, a heck of a lot of that goes to yourself because it's you're very knowledgeable about that subject. I'm not blowing smoke up your behind, but that makes it a lot easier. I'm just really glad that people have listened to it, and I got a huge reaction when the episode came out. Swamped with emails, quite a few of them going, they'd like to bury me in a shallow grave. Others who were, very complimentary. There's quite a few. Just most of them were just interested, and just say, and asking questions and so on, and say, oh, my a family member was involved, and so on. It was mainly Irish that contacted me, and they were all got either family member involved or this or that and whatever, and they just wanted to talk about it, and so yeah, the reaction was huge.
You might start us off there. Give us kind of, if you will, like the cliff notes on Derry's significance in Irish history generally, not just in the Troubles, which we'll get onto, but in shaping the North, and indeed in retrospect, kind of like would say like very heavily influencing this trouble, this time that we know as the Troubles, but centuries earlier.
Fascinating place. Really monastic community was where it really all started, and then of course when the plantations were around in kind of Tudor times is coming up as the idea of how to, in that famous phrase, solve the Irish problem, and so on. It was, I know what, let's solve it, says King James, by handing over Derry, which was a small place at the time, and all of the surrounding land, vast tracts of it, to this guild of vintners and drapers and salters and God knows what else from London, and we'll just hand it over to them. And all they have to do is build this walled city at huge expense, and we can, we as England can then use that to dominate, the north of Ireland, and it went on from then huge plantation, and then it really kind of snowballed in historical terms. So obviously the siege of Derry, the apprentice boys locking out Catholic James the Second's army, no surrender being shouted from the walls, etc., etc., and it then becomes the maiden city, its walls never having been breached, and then for several centuries it suffered that kind of big brother little brother syndrome with Belfast, and it was most countries have between their kind of their biggest city, usually their capital, and their kind of second largest in that. This is obviously in the context of the north, taking away the south and Dublin, and it lost that war, for economic and social dominance, in the north, lost it to Belfast. Belfast just grew and grew and grew, and becomes a kind of a black hole, terrestrial black hole, sucking in, like just as in England, London does. London sucks in everything around it. It's just, it's you clinging on outside by your fingertips, and then you just whoosh, you're sucked into it, and then there's nothing you can do. And Belfast did much the same to Derry, and then it became in so many ways a symbol of all that was wrong, in Northern Ireland. So following partition, so because partition, it's Derry was a nationalist majority city. The county surrounding it, that was unionist majority, but the city was desperate to kind of boundary commission time. Let's go. We want to go and join Donegal. Is what we want to do. This is where our hinterland is. That's where we feel the affinity and connected to. And of course, we all know boundary commission in the end ended up doing nothing at all, left it all as it was. And so, Derry and its nationalist kind of majority felt very much marooned. Um, and with the unionists, for them, it was part of their history. The siege of Derry and so on, hugely influential. So it became this kind of uh, cornerstone of Protestant unionist tradition in the north. So I mean, in a way, it's like Pristina down in the Balkans and so on for the Serbs. I mean, now it's Pristina is Kosovo is absolutely a Muslim city and so on. But in Serb historical terms, as far as they're concerned, they could never let it go because it's just hugely important psychologically. And the same with Derry for unionists is that the more that the nationalist majority got bigger and bigger and so on, the less likely the unionists were to let go of it because it really is a totem, in that regard. And then it led, as we know, into the 60s and the civil rights movement, when people started to lift their eyes up from the ground and say, this is what's wrong. This is, where are the jobs? Where are the houses? And so and the lack of jobs and housing comes all the way from the way the state is structured and the way the state views us, the Roman Catholics, as second class citizens. And I mean, that's a massive oversimplification because the city had a lot of issues, besides all of that, and so on. But it brought everything into a harsh focus. Rising consumerism. People want some money in their pockets. They want to buy the latest, jeans, and they want to go out and they want to, have a life. After austerity and rationing's gone and all this type of thing. And in Derry, that was very, very difficult to do. And hence it goes into, the civil rights movement, which really, I mean, Belfast was hugely important, but in my view, Derry was the centre of the civil rights movement. And hence you get the Battle of the Bogside and so on. And it wasn't, it wasn't the IRA in that, I mean, the story about Belfast, the classic one was the loyalist burnouts of Bombay Street and all this type of thing. IRA is I ran away. You don't get that in Derry because it's civil rights. That's the people saying it's civil rights. The IRA is pretty moribund. This is what we want to achieve, and they don't, and they take it on themselves. So the Battle of the Bogside wasn't orchestrated by the IRA. It wasn't led by the IRA. People like Sean Keenan were involved, of course, from the community, but it was very much a community-driven event, and they weren't looking for the IRA to operate in their kind of Catholic defender tradition, and so on. They were looking to kind of do it themselves, and of course, then it went on. And we'll get into the 70s and so on. And of course, Derry is unique in the same way that Belfast is unique in terms of Belfast threw up one of the people who will be spoken about, forever in Gerry Adams, in terms of the movement. And of course, Derry has its own Gerry Adams. It's got Martin McGuinness, and you cannot think of the Troubles and the war in the north and so on without thinking of those two men. And that's so Derry has so much part of it, and the modern part of it is really embodied in Martin McGuinness.
I was going to say, it's always fascinating to me, just like when you were, no one chooses the year they were born, and no one chooses the events that happen as you're coming into being a man. But then there's people like Brendan Hughes, Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness. They're kind of at that kind of prime male fighting, get involved in something age, just purely by quirk of when they were born.
Yeah,
Martin McGuinness, of course, is someone who would have his life defined and shaped by this conflict, but also him defining and shaping the conflict as well.
there's a bit of me that says, that they're interesting in different ways. But Adams comes from a Republican tradition. Obviously, his father, was a volunteer and so on. So, and the Adams and the Hanaways are two, kind of Republican royalty in Belfast, and so the fact that Jerry's the son of an Adams and a Hanaway, kind of brings them together. But whereas McGuinness doesn't have any of that. His mum's a housewife. His father works in a foundry, and his father is, it's a devout Catholic household, and Martin absolutely inherited that, and so on. But his father is anti. He doesn't like the IRA because he doesn't. For him, it's socialist. It's the red threat, and so on, which goes against all the church's teachings, and also it's the violence. And he is non-violent, and he's not. They are there. It is a nationalist household, not a Republican household, and it's a non-violent one. So, and I was always looking: is there an event, therefore, in McGuinness's life that switches him off and switches him over and what have you? And I can't see one. I think it was the environment at the time, and himself alone, really.
On what you were saying about the gerrymandering, when people do talk about like the inequality with housing, especially this one Derry example gets used and should. It's that 14,000 nationalist voters could elect 8 councillors to the 12 elected by only 8,000 unionists. Yeah, it's one of the more glaring examples of the inequality.
Well, and jobs is a huge thing. And of course, issues they've got there, and because Derry had lost the economic war with Belfast, it had a tradition of linen manufacture, shirt making was the big industry in the city, but times had changed. So the old days of Derry made shirts that were the premium for premium brand all over the world. Far East was taking over that, so cheap manufacturing was starting to hollow out, and that sort of thing. It used to have a shipyard, and so that had closed because Harland and Wolff was growing like fury over in Belfast, and that was where they're going to make ships. So it wasn't going to be in Derry. So all the kind of jobs, people looked at where do we invest, where are we going to do it, and Derry just kept on losing out and losing out and losing out, and then that trickled over into the housing because of course, I mean, the geography of Derry, it's kind of hemmed in by the hills around it. So trying to build houses was difficult, and they got caught in the baby boom. And that was pretty much the same in so much of Western Europe and so on. So trying to build, council put in place a plan to build houses that not enough, but enough to hopefully try and slow the problem down. And it was just a tsunami of babies just washed over them, and they could not keep up. And we can say how much of that was by design, or just in incompetence or inability to get things done. But the reality it came down to was, what everybody knows, which is that you have old housing that's pretty dreadful conditions, that you have two, three, four families in the one property. And I say it in the book. You have kids taking turns to sleep, and so on, and the rest of them are turfed out until it's their turn, in the bed and what have you, and particularly youngsters growing up, and as we said, they're hitting those years, and trying to get a job is just hard as. And then it's, well, what's your future? And you can just see you're being lauded over in that way, and that's very much how they viewed it. The residents of the Bogside and the Cregan and so on thought the odds are stacked against me, and I can't do anything. And that's, I can't imagine how soul destroying that is, for anyone, let alone an entire community.
So obviously, in shaping the north itself, Derry is very significant. It's significant, but in this this time or conflict that we call the Troubles, of utmost significance as well. If you look on the Malcolm Sutton Index of deaths, the first two of the conflict are in Derry, in the rioting, I believe. The first IRA adult to die in the conflict was by his own device, but it was in Derry. Interestingly enough, the first UVF man to die in the conflict was by his own bomb. Talk us through this the rioting and I guess eventual Battle of the Bogside that led to the government kind of having to throw their hands up and say, "Look, we can't handle it," and the army getting brought in.
Yeah, there was just mounting tensions between the community, both in the county and the city. It was focused in the city, but Dungiven, there were riots in Dungiven. Francis McCloskey um, has the horrible tragedy of supposedly being the first person to be killed in the Troubles, and there riot in the high street, and I went there, Dungiven. It's a lovely village, and so on, and walk by all of the bars, and there is his plaque in the pavement, and so on, because he got banged on the head, and so on, was found afterwards, brain hemorrhage, and passed away, and no one's brought to justice for it, and so that adds to the resentment, and then it starts to happen all over the city, and it just gets it's like a pressure cooker, and of course the one thing that Derry really suffered from at the time was Protestant marching season, and that is just lighting the touch paper. It's the summer, and so on, because that's when the apprentice boys do their thing to coincide with, of course, and so on. And of course, the fact of the matter is that if people are going to riot worldwide, they tend to do it in the summer because it's warm. So they'll go outside at night and throw bricks and so on because it's not cold. Riots do happen during the winter, but if you do look at the kind of chronology of when people riot, it tends to be during the summer, warmer months. That's very much the pitch of it. And those two communities kind of going head to head in such a confrontational manner, and it's Derry's very geography that promotes that. So you've got an apprentice boy parade that's 2 miles long with bands and flutes and all that sort of paraphernalia, and parading along the city walls, looking down on the Bogside, and they're throwing coins at the downwards in a demonstration of we can afford it, here's our superiority, and so on. Locals are they are retaliating, marbles on slingshots, and it doesn't take long for that to just explode, and the RUC are trying to in effect protect the marchers and ban charge the counter demonstrators in the Bogside, and it's just a disaster. It's an absolute disaster because for once the residents of the Bogside are organised, and really it's one of those tipping points where they've just said, right, enough is enough, and we're gonna do something about it, and then you get the Battle of Bogside, which we talked earlier about. Where's that tipping point for people like Martin McGuinness and so on, and maybe it wasn't for him per se, but it was for an awful lot of young nationalists in Derry. It was this is it, and the fact is they could fight the RUC and kind of keep them out of the Bogside for like 3 days, and pretty much bring the RUC to a standstill. I mean, they'd had to ship in Anthony Peacock, the RUC chief constable. He shipped in, several hundred officers, because Derry didn't have a huge police force, from all over the province to police this thing. And at the end of the end of 3 days, they were down from like 700 to just over 400 that were fit for duty. And he's like going, well, we've got to continue. And his deputy's telling him, sir, this is not going to fly anymore. The police force is literally on the brink of collapse, and you are going to have to call in the army. And he was loath to do it, because police of all stripes in whatever country do not like handing over to the military. because they see it uh, as a representation of their own failure and the failure of the force that they lead, and also, and in my opinion, quite rightly, they are very, very wary of what the military will do, and so on. Because because armies are, I mean, they're recruited and they're trained and equipped and armed to do a very, very different force, very different thing from a police force. An army is a hammer, and for a hammer, every problem looks like a nut. That's what it does. So all you got to do is hit it, and so on, and then problem goes away. And of course, that isn't the case. And you can look to the base recruits. If you're joining a police force as a young man or woman, you are going to work in a community. That's what you're doing, and you're not there to go and shoot anyone you don't like, or there's not an enemy. There is the population who you are there to serve, and it is your job to wheedle out the bad eggs from the majority good and make sure they're punished, and so on. By a judicial process. People that join the army, what they're they are there to, and then what they want is an enemy that's identifiable that they are going to then defeat, and so on. So it's chalk and cheese, and that was But in the end, Peacock had really no choice, and politicians were calling for it as well, saying we've got to bring the army in because this is just chaos, and the RUC is not the right organisation to handle this. And then the army had to actually respond. Not that I've not seen anything or interviewed anyone who was absolutely gagging to get on the streets at all. Quite the opposite. Most of them didn't even know what they were walking into, and so on, and just thought it was if anything, it would be whatever it was. It would be over very, very quickly. Of course, it wasn't.
I guess kind of two questions, but can you go through in terms of the very early days after the army called in? Can you talk us through I guess this little kind of honeymoon period, the famous kind of tea and toast, kind of in between time, and also in this time, kind of how Martin McGuinness actually came to find himself in like a leadership role.
It wasn't just a Derry phenomenon. The tea and buns kind of piece. It happened in Belfast as well, and etc. And it has been kind of concerted efforts to rubbish it from certain people and so on. But there's just too much evidence. There's too much testimony from all sides. There's too much photographic evidence, and so on to say anything that it did happen. That the Catholic communities, in general, not all, obviously, not all of them, but the majority just breathed a huge sigh of relief because they're the soldiers. One, they're keeping the loyalists away from us who can burn us out and God knows what else, and two, they're keeping the RUC out, who they're keeping the loyalist police force as far as they're concerned. They're keeping them out, and they're the B Specials militia, the B men, the dreaded bogeyman B men that they absolutely detest. So they see the army and they go, "Oh, thank God, these are our saviors." And of course, for the soldiers themselves, they are not given hardly any information whatsoever. They're not steeped in the traditions of the North or anything. The vast majority have had a pretty basic formal education in schools in Scotland, Wales, England, and what have you. No knowledge, never passed down in history. There's no history lesson in a normal English school or Welsh school or Scots school about, oh, by the way, right, today's lesson is about the plantations and the flight of the earls, the Uwe Neils and all this. There just isn't. There's no conversation of Irish history. So they're completely cold. And so on, and there's just women coming out with huge plates of sandwiches and cups of tea and being all lovely to them, and they're thinking, well, this is absolutely great, but we're not entirely sure what we're doing here. But then at the same time, they get involved in, and funny enough, the army guys and actually a couple of volunteers I spoke to about it, they get involved in friendly rioting. And that's the way that they described it. I don't know how any writing is friendly, but they seem to think it was. And so you get British soldiers coming over who they'd be based in improvised, if you like, bases in the city, because of course everything barracks is there. That's solid, but there's a range of other kind of outstations which they take over and start to put some sandbags up, and it is all very amateurish, kind of at this stage of the game. But then they do a few patrols, do a shift and what have you, and then they go to the pub. So the Bogside Inn, soldiers are drinking in the Bogside Inn, with Republicans all around them, and they all know each, and it's pretty obvious that they're soldiers. I mean, they're wearing jeans and t-shirts and so on, but you stick out like a bear's whatever's in the Bogside Inn if you're not from around those parts, and they know who the other players, and they know that they were the writers, and then they'd all right, that's it. They go right, okay, we're off now. Finish our beers, down, and off they go. And the soldiers will be like, well, finish my beer and we'll go back to base, change into our kit, and we meet on the corner of William Street and get on with our riot. And once we've had the riot and bricks and bottles and all that type of thing, and then they'll just say, right, that's enough. That's enough. The rioters say, right, that's it. Okay, bedtime, fellas. See you tomorrow. And of course, I'm generalizing and so on and parodying a bit for effect. But to be honest, that was actually what was happening. To a large degree, and the city was in bounds. You'd have young squads meeting a lot of local girls, because people are people, and squads getting, unfortunately, local lads, 25% unemployment rate, and so a lot of them not getting a wage, so they can't afford to buy a girl a drink and take her to the pitches, and so on. Whereas a British soldier can, and yeah, people are people. But for Martin, he leaves school young, as they all did, and so on. No pathway for further education, let alone university, of course. He gets a job as a butcher's assistant. In Dirty's Butchers in the Rossville flats, and yeah, I interviewed a couple of volunteers who worked there with him. He was in cold meats, so black pudding, that sort of thing. That's what he did. And during his lunch breaks, he'd go out and take part in the friendly rioting, just like it, because that's what everyone was doing. He got caught and got bound over, keep the peace for 2 years. His dad is absolutely shocked, mortified that his son, is now a convict and whatever, and basically says, you've got to leave. I don't want anything to do with those people. Stay away from it. And Martin basically says no. I'm gonna carry on, and that's really the beginning for him of his movement, of his journey, into the movement, and how it starts. But of course, it coincides with big changes, and of course, the big change was the split, and that was over Christmas and New Year of 1970-71. The big move. So the southern-based leadership in the IRA want to get rid of abstentionism, which to everybody outside republicanism means nothing whatsoever, and so on. No one is like going, abstentionism. What the heck? That's a word you put in a crossword puzzle or Scrabble. It would get you millions of points on a Scrabble board. But what does it actually mean?
It sounds more like you're celibate.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I'm abstentionist from the other sex. I mean, you're right, and of course, but it is about, we're going to stand in elections, but more importantly, if we win, we are going to take our seats in whatever assembly we're voted to, be it the Doyle at Leinster House or House of Commons at Westminster, and of course to traditional Republicans, that is anathema, because for them it is about, they draw their they are what gives them the kind of the legal right, as they see it over time, to use armed force, is the fact that they will not recognise the assemblies put in in partition. Is that they don't exist. They are illegal, and so on. So we will not recognise them. And of course that led to a group of hardliners, as the Southern leadership would call them, splitting off and forming the provisionals. Which they didn't like the name. It was only meant to be, you know, provisional kind of IRA. The provisional bit was only meant to be for a very, very short time until they got rid of it and became just the IRA, because in effect they take over, and of course then it led to the rump that they'd left. Well, not the rump, but the main body that they left became the official IRA. They were the provisional IRA. And there's, they both got Sinn Féins. It all becomes very confusing, and so on. But for for Derry in particular, because that was Belfast, because that's really where the provisionals were born. Derry was different. Derry was in its rioting, and then Martin joins the officials. Didn't even know they were officials. They were just the IRA as far as he was concerned. But just gets very quickly frustrated, along with a few other youngsters who all join. And it's because they're just not, they're given lectures on Marxist ideology, and how the working class need to work together to free their chains from the oppressor, etc. And of course they're going, whatever, give me a gun because I want to go and take on the British Army. Get me, give me something to, give me some explosives. I want to, we've got to fight back. And that was he met actually Sean McStuffin and Dathie O'Connell over in Donegal, who were provisional leaders, and said, "You're the guys for me." Meeting of minds, and then that's him. He's in the provisionals, and again, it's one of those moments in time, and it's not a happy coincidence because there's nothing happy about it. But at that point, there's this small cohort of teenagers and 21-year-olds like Martin in the provisionals, but there's an older generation who all took part in the border conflicts in the 50s, early 60s, and then they have the McCall tragedy, so that where Tommy McCall and Joe Coyle and Tommy Carlin, so on, mixing a bomb, century bomb on there. Tommy McCall's kitchen table, premature explosion. They're all killed along, unfortunately, with two of the McCall children. I mean, absolute. I can't imagine how a family gets or anyone gets over that. And that was in the Craigan. But what that did, by total tragic happenstance, was remove kind of a layer of older guys. So the likes of Martin McGuinness, Eamon Lafferty, Colin Keenan, young guys are suddenly in the driving seat in Derry, and it's, well, what are we going to do? And they're pretty clear about what they want to do, and they really want to take things to another level. They don't want to just throw bricks. They want to start setting off bombs. They want to carry out shoots. They want to take the British Army on, and of course then things start to escalate, and of course we get the first two kind of killings by the army in the city, Cusack and Beatty, day after each other, and that does flick a switch in the community, and I'm in. It was my battalion that were resident in the city at the time, and I never knew that because obviously I joined years and years later. I never knew that they were in Derry at the time, and so I was serving with guys who'd never talked about it, and so when I was researching the book, I mentioned it to these guys who were a lot older than myself now, and they went, "Oh yeah, we were there in 1970." And I'm like, "What? You are joking?" And they went, "Oh yeah, we were the first resident battalion in Derry City. We were there for 2 years, up until we left just after Bloody Sunday." And I'm like going, "And why has no one mentioned this before?" They went, "Years ago." And it was absolutely bizarre. So they were all there as young private soldiers. And they said that the shootings of Beatty and Cusack changed the mood in the city. All of a sudden, all the bars were put out of bounds. You could no longer go and have a pint in the Bogside Inn. or anything like that. No wandering around in the Cregan with a girl, anything like that. And it suddenly became much more like this is guerrilla insurgency. This is serious. This isn't just a few bricks being thrown. This is real trouble now.
On that note, actually, okay, so just maybe for people who aren't as familiar with like Irish geography and stuff, Derry is like you said, it's considerably smaller than Belfast. It is the northernmost city on the whole island. It's fairly close to the border. It has with Donegal, it has Buncrana and to a lesser degree Letterkenny to serve as its Dundalk in the way that Dundalk
Yeah.
would be for others. Um, in terms of size, it's more to be more comparable now, like to Limerick. If you know, if yeah, if anyone's kind of more familiar. Um, one thing I noticed, and it did happen in Belfast plenty too, and other places, but I guess Derry's a bit smaller, so as a percentage, it shows up more. But there was a lot of these examples of we'll say kind of like lateral enforcement of certain norms. Like for example, like there was like girls going out with soldiers and paying a price for it. Not from up high, not from like someone above you, but like your peers. There's a few like tar and featherings that I was thinking of. Yeah, there's a lot of this kind of community based enforcement of norms.
There's a very very famous photo, and I include it in the book of a young girl who's tarred and feathered in the Bogside, and her name was Marta Dirty, and she was 19. She was engaged to a member of my battalion, a guy called John Larter, who apparently was renowned throughout the battalion as having the biggest hands anyone had ever seen. They literally, he was a very quiet guy from Beccles in Suffolk, huge hands. Him and Marta had met. They went out for a couple of months, got engaged. He was going to convert to Catholicism and was undergoing instruction from a local Catholic priest in order to do so, with the idea being that they would then marry. And then when the battalion left, it was about 18 months later, the next posting, luckily, was Cyprus. Very, very nice. 2 years in Cyprus they were going for. Marta would obviously go with him as his wife. And it was no secret that the two of them were going out and they were engaged and so on. But yes, she'd had the two of them been warned off. A couple of times she'd had people knocking on the door saying, Marta, you shouldn't be doing this. And then they've been out one night, and then three local kind of volunteers, one of them armed with a pistol, again threatened them. Marta, very, very brave lady, stood in front of John, and when the gun went off, John got shot in one of his hands because apparently, like I said, they were the biggest thing on him, and so on. And he was obviously treated, but yeah, and then she got tarred and feathered. I mean, again, one of the differences, and you're very much right to kind of point it out. One of the differences, and the huge differences, that's very very relevant between Derry and Belfast is that you've obviously got the river and so on in Belfast as you have in Derry, but the foil for Derry really does mark a boundary line. And yes, there are Catholics on the East Bank, but not that many, and the Gobner Scale is really the kind of the centre of that, and round about the waterside. And there are Protestants on the West Bank in the markets and so on, but not many. The vast majority of people on the East Bank were Protestants. The vast majority of people on the West Bank were Catholics. So what you then didn't have was that kind of they'd have to go over a bridge over the river if they were going to burn each other out, to put it bluntly. Whereas West Belfast, Llankill and the Falls, well, you don't have to go over. Literally, it's 15 yards. And you're there, and that led to that helped lead to real friction because they are cheek by jowl, whereas Derry just wasn't the same, and so on. So that's partly why you don't have the Bombay streets going on in Derry, because you don't have that the street right next to each other. Right, we're going to go and burn them out, and so on. Because if you're going to do that, you're going to have to cross the river, and they just don't mix, in that way. If you were born in the born in the Bogside, the chances of going over to the east side really limited, and vice versa. You didn't get people from the waterside and what have you that head over to the Cregan. It just didn't happen. But yeah, there were societal norms and so on. But there was never in the city that kind of overt sectarian viciousness, if I can put it like that, that disfigured and was disfiguring Belfast at the time. They definitely didn't like each other and so on, but it wasn't of the same magnitude. I don't think anyway.
I was going to say funny for a city that birthed the term "no surrender." Until the 90s, there kind of really wasn't there wasn't really kind of much like loyalist paramilitary activity to speak of. I mean, you pointed out in the book, it's more the loyalists that are there are more UDA than UVF. But like it's so rare that you ever read about the Derry loyalists.
After doing East Tyrone and obviously knowing what I know about Belfast, I thought that the Loyalists would have the Loyalist paramilitaries would have a significant role to play from the start, because in Belfast they did. Absolutely. You get UVF obviously kicked things off when they killed Gussie Spence shooting Peter Ward and all that type of stuff, and then you have the advent of the UDA, and then it's later cover name of the UFF and all this type of rubbish, etc. But they're huge there, and then you get the likes of the UVF big in Mid Ulster, in those rural areas where again the communities are rubbing against each other very firmly. But I just didn't. There just wasn't anything, and you're right. There wasn't anything really like that up in the northwest, and so on round Derry. Of course, there were, loyalists and so on, but there just wasn't the organisation, the drive, particularly in the 70s. Very, very little. It was kind of fluid, controlled, geared around very small numbers of individuals, and they just didn't play a big part in it, to be honest.
Okay, so back to the early days and to Martin McGuinness's rise. Funny, internment, which was kind of known as being, I guess, kind of semi-successful. It like a lot of the people rounded up were like it was like old information. They weren't involved anymore, or they weren't kind of involved at all. You mentioned there that in Derry, where was it? In Derry, there was like just kind of like just over a dozen actually brought in, and in fairness, it was actually most of the leadership was actually caught up in the net, and this then led to I guess kind of a power vacuum that Martin McGuinness and some of the youngers just kind of happened to be there to fill.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, internment. I mean, Kieran Conway, obviously former director of intelligence of the provisionals and so on, as I'm sure most listeners know. He never subscribed to this, and he makes the point himself. Never subscribed to this theory that internment was a boon for the IRA, and he specifically points out that Derry, it really did. It took off a lot of the older leadership, and left a vacuum that the likes of Martin McGuinness and Eamon Lafferty and Colin Keenan, they allowed them to move into it. And Belfast, it was. I mean, Belfast was a disaster, and so on. It just shot themselves in both feet, the security forces and the government with it, rounded up a load of people who had nothing to do. Famously, there was one old guy. I can't remember how old he was, but he was absolutely chuffed as bits that he got arrested, and in turn, because he was like going, "I'm still a thorn in the side of the British all these years later." Retired and what have you, sitting there most nights having his Bovril or whatever, and he goes, I'm still an enemy of the state, yes, and he was over the moon with it. I mean, I'm being a bit facetious about it, but yeah, Derry, they just didn't have that, and so it worked to a degree, but internment is one of those things. Again, your readers are very, very knowledgeable. Sorry, your listeners are very knowledgeable, and I'm sure most of them would know that when internment has really worked against the IRA, it's when the North and the South do it together. So Second World War, the border campaign, and so on. That's when. So if Dublin is locking them up in the Curragh, by the hundred, and so on, as well as the North doing it, that tends to really squeeze the life, because where are they going to go? That's the thing. But of course, by unilaterally doing it, as Stormont and the British government did, it just it allowed everyone. I mean, for Derry, it allowed everyone to scootle over the border into Donegal. And like I said, they're all in Buncrana or Ballyboffy or Letterkenny, and so on, and safe as houses, and just seeing what the heck is going to happen. And of course, it just it fuels again the resentment, because it's where are the even, and particularly for Belfast, obviously I know we're not talking about Belfast, but because there's no Protestants involved, because there's no Loyalists rounded up. There's not, even though, as we just said, the Loyalists, particularly in Belfast, were very active, and likes of Gussie Spence, he was obviously locked up at the time, but these were people carrying out sectarian killings, sectarian murders, and they're not being interned, and so it just feeds into that narrative that says we're the enemy. We as Catholics are the enemy in what is supposedly our own country, and yeah, that just kind of feeds the beast.
You mentioned there regarding internment. There had been a soldier killed in Derry previous to it in February 71, but I think this was like you could almost call it an accident. I think like a petrol bomb caused a fire extinguisher to
Yeah,
explode.
William Jolliffe.
He was killed by it.
William Jolliffe, Lance Corporal, Royal Military Policeman, travelling in a vehicle. Yeah, and it was petrol bomb blew up under the wagon, sets off the smoke, fire extinguisher in the back, which is poisonous, and he chokes to death. So it wasn't an IRA attack and so on. For his family, absolute tragedy, and so on. But that's what I mean. The Beatty and the Cusack killings really did shake the city, because everything. I mean, it's not like nothing was going on beforehand, but interviewing people from all sides, it just kept on coming up. It kept on coming up. That was, that changed, the whole tenor of what was going on. So it was rioting before, but it was civil rights, and it was, the position of the army was slightly ambiguous. They weren't, they weren't as much in the tea and buns phase as they had been initially, but there was no outright hostility towards them. But the shootings of Beatty and Cusack, that really did start to change things, because Derry probably, much more than Belfast, has a feel in many ways of a town rather than a city. Particularly if you're a Bogsider, you don't see yourself in the wider context of the whole city on both banks of the river. You see yourself as a Bogsider on the east bank, not on the west bank, where this is where my community is. And in that environment, it's you don't know everybody, of course, but the interconnection is huge. And so all of a sudden, two people, and you probably are bound to know one at least of them, or a family member of one of them, or what have you, and they're suddenly shot dead. Then then it gets deadly serious, and it's a real marker.
Yeah, I was going to say after Operation Demetrius, the official name of the internment roundup. Yeah, the eight British soldiers would be killed by the IRA in the 12 months following Operation Demetrius. The first being literally the day after it, while dismantling a barricade in the Craigan. You pointed out that apparently it was a headshot from a Thompson submachine gun. And according to the RUC, there were two of such weapons in the city, and one of them apparently owned by Martin McGuinness. Now that's a lot of like could be, but yeah.
No idea what you're talking about. I couldn't possibly draw any lines or links between that, and I have absolutely no documentary or other evidence to prove otherwise. However, one could surmise that perhaps Martin McGuinness was involved, and in a lot of ways, I mean, we never know now, but it would be, you'd see that as being natural. By this stage, he is not officially the officer commanding the Derry Brigade, but he's pretty much seen as because they don't really have that structure at that time, particularly after the old leadership had got lifted and interned. But he's very much a leading light. And so you would and leading a young group of volunteers, you would expect a leader in that environment to be involved, rather than sitting somewhere safe and ordering out their minions to do their work for them, and they take they take the risk. You would expect a leader to lead from the front in that regard. So I would consider it, and I have no evidence to base that on, but I would consider it highly likely that he was involved, at least involved.
Okay, so could you characterize the type of attacks that were going on in I guess Derry City in this kind of like the time that gets called like the Wild West days, kind of before the IRA and the British both kind of refined their methods. It was this kind of like shootouts in the street that's fairly unique to like these early years of the conflict. Can you go into some of them for me?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it was very much mirrored Belfast in that way, where it was small groups of volunteers with very few armaments. I mean, we're talking, mainly Second World War vintage. So as we said, Thompson submachine guns, American-made Garans, maybe some M1 carbines, that sort of thing. So we're not and not a ton of ammunition. So they've got to be careful with the weapons they've got and the ammunition that they have. So, but they want to get out. They want to take on the British Army. That's what they want to do. They don't want to, hang around. And the RUC was a target, but the target they saw in front of them mostly was the army. RUC as well, if they could do that, because they very much felt it was sectarian force that was very much against them. But they wanted to take them on. They wanted to prove to themselves and the young men and to their community that they could take on soldiers in really on the streets, which led to a whole series of gun battles, and shootouts. We're not talking you know, Saving Private Ryan with hundreds of men shooting each other and grenades being thrown and all that type of thing. But it's pretty dramatic, and particularly in the streets that we're talking about, crammed housing together, paper thin walls, and so on. So rounds just kicking off all over the place. So you start to get tragedies. Annette McGavigan, 14-year-old girl, who's shot by a British soldier, and so on, where she's not involved at all, etc. But these things, unfortunately, when you start to get weapons that the British Army at the time would be the standard weapon was the SLR self-loading rifle, 7.62 millimeter, which was a weapon designed for. It's a very, very powerful high velocity rifle, and it's designed to fight the Warsaw Pact forces invading the North German plain. It is, and you're firing from hundreds of meters away. That's all. It is not designed to gun battles at 40, 50 feet away from each other, almost in the tenement blocks of the Bogside and such. It's in there. It's a disaster. And you're going to get casualties, and of course what McGuinness did as well, which was very interesting, was that he'd absolutely wanted to take on the army, but he really began the whole IRA kind of campaign of economic bombing. So it wasn't just the Crown forces, as Republicans would term them, the army and the IUC and what have you. It wasn't just them who were against them. It was the whole structure, the whole social and economic structure of Northern Ireland, and hence of Britain, that was bearing down on them, and that had to be destroyed and gotten rid of, because that's where Unionist power and British power grew from. Of course, as Mao would say, it grew from the barrel of a gun, but it also came from the power of the till, and so on, and the cash going through it. So it was commercial bombing, and so on, the car bomb, and so on. Let's incendiary devices. Let's the Durex, incendiary device, which uh, Derry pioneered, and so on. So you'd be able to take it in, put it in a coat, in a department store, in a boutique shop or whatever, and then next thing you know, boom, the place is on fire. Car bomb blows up the shops, and it did. It reduced, the centre of the city, which they saw very much, the volunteers saw very much as a bastion of unionism and a place that was almost designed to keep them down. I mean, it was just blown to hell. I mean, it was 150 shops. I think there was about 20, less than 30, I think, still open in a relatively short period of time. I mean, can you imagine a city where your city centre is, you can't, there's no point going shopping there because there's no shops because they're just blown up or burnt to the ground. And of course, the whole idea was, yeah, let's cause economic chaos and precipitate a crisis in government where, the British say, enough's enough. There's no point. It's costing us vast amounts of money, and there's no point in doing it. I mean, you can see, and I mean, funny enough, I know we're not talking about that subject, but you can see how that starts the whole thing that kind of ends, if you like, with the South Armagh Brigade bombs in the city of London. So Canary Wharf and the Baltic Exchange and all that type of thing. 30 years, almost 30 years later, causing vast economic damage. That's really, that kind of started in a big way in Derry with Martin McGuinness.
Obviously, the year 1972, to anyone who's kind of studied the subject, was like a particularly bloody and dark. It was literally the highest, had the highest death toll of any year. Starts off very significantly in Derry at the end of January with Bloody Sunday. Like you mentioned in the book, it's not a book about Bloody Sunday, and I don't know if you said this, but like it's kind of it's such a huge kind of subject that if you were to kind of get into it in any way, you kind of you kind of owe it to people to explore like all the avenues. So yeah, just on that note though, like as a former soldier, this decision to swap out the resident soldiers and replace them with like the most aggressive, some of the most aggressive attack dog type soldiers that the British Army had, the paras, and bring them in for what is supposedly like a policing type job to kind of look after this march, this protest. Yeah, as a former soldier, is that like bizarre to you? This decision?
It more than bizarre. I mean, first things first. It was, I always knew that you know Bloody Sunday, in terms of how was I going to do it in the book, because it is just it's a monumental um, day, and just tragic. I mean, there is just no other word. The tragedy is just beyond words, and and so I would, yeah, and no excuses, from no. But I thought, if I go into it in any sort of detail, like you said, John, you've got to owe it to everyone to really kind of, there's been so many inquiries, and particularly the Bloody Sunday inquiry, and all of the. I'm thinking, I can't add anything new to that of any description, and it's still so raw. I mean, it's still just incredibly such a raw subject, and so I thought, I'm purposely going to. I can't not mention it, obviously, but I don't want it to become centerpiece of the book, because the book is about the Derry Brigade of the Provisional IRA, and of course that's not it's not about Bloody Sunday. It's about the Derry Brigade, and of course that has an impact on them. But there you go. But yes, it was just why, because of course my battalion is there. They've been there almost 2 years, so those guys knew the city and the people like the backs of their hand. They knew how everything worked. They'd been involved with the police on dozens and dozens of civil rights demonstrations and parades. It's not like they hadn't made mistakes before, or there hadn't been tragedies, because as we just talked about, of course there had been. But they knew and the locals knew them, and that didn't mean that they'd be nicey picey with each other and so on. But there's a level of understanding and knowledge, which in those situations, my personal view is that's crucial. But from talking to ex-soldiers and so on, they had a sense that they were, my own battalion was considered a bit too chummy with the people of Derry, and particularly the ones that were like to riot. That they weren't harsh enough. That they weren't, let's get in amongst them and so on, and we'll give them a good hiding. And so there was a sense that, right, we'll send in one para who, are, you know paratroopers are chosen and trained for, they're self-selecting, because of course you've got to volunteer, like everyone in the British Army, you've got to be a volunteer. But people don't go and volunteer for the paras if you're a shy wallflower. In my experience, people who volunteer for the parachute regiment are, very aggressive, and they want to be. They are very, very good light infantry soldiers in a combat environment. I would not say that policing a civil rights demonstration, on a Sunday in Derry, was a combat situation. It wasn't. It just wasn't. And how they let themselves, the lack of discipline, the lack of morality about what I just find gobsmacking. I mean, I can, and again, I hope your listeners give me some kind of a bit of rope here, probably enough to hang myself with, but I can understand's not the right word, but I can see, in the heat of a riot and what have you, and something goes tragically wrong, and one individual gets shot and then unfortunately dies. I can see, and then it's like, and then that's a moment of, oh my god, what the hell? So I could, almost accident. And again, please, if your listeners give me a bit of leeway on that, I'd very much appreciate it. That would be a tragedy, and that would be awful. But I
But
can see,
these things do happen in those situations. Yeah.
they do, and that's the reality of humankind. But this is as far away from that as can possibly be imagined, and yeah, absolutely dreadful. Should never have happened, and so on. And of course, framed the Derry Brigade, and the people of Derry, because if the shootings of Beatty and Cusack had been a tipping point, then Bloody Sunday was yeah. I mean, I don't know I don't know what's bigger than a tipping point, but a very,
Like,
very big tipping point.
like an avalanche point, yeah.
And exactly, and it was a disaster. I mean, the guys who, because my battalion would then put on the kind of outer ring. That's what they did. So the center of the city was taken over by one para, and then soldiers from my battalion were put in an outer ring to do vehicle checkpoints. So they could hear the shooting, and they're like going, what is going on? Like, what the hell is happening? And they were just gobsmacked. And of course, they're hearing it over the radio net, and it's just like, this is just chaos. And they were dumbfounded, utterly dumbfounded. And they then left shortly afterwards to done their 2-year tour, and so on. But yeah, I mean, it was just a nightmare. And of course, understandably, queues of people looking to join the provisionals in the more than they could possibly have weaponry for, and so on. And yeah, a day of shame for the army. To be honest, I mean, it's just horrible,
Um,
absolutely horrible.
Funny, you kind of talk about the fact that it's kind of still like kind of touches the nerve and stuff. We're literally, I mean, over 50 years after it. In September of this, we're recording this mid-April. In September, Soldier F is on trial, so it's still, I mean, it's still it's still very much in people's minds and in like affecting people's lives very seriously. If anyone does want to, I did a full episode on it, like the actual the path of the march and so on with okay, so I believe the youngest of what 14 were killed.
Yeah,
Was 14 killed? Okay, so the
yeah,
youngest I believe was a fella called Duddy. He was like a young promising boxer actually, and niece who never met him. Obviously, Julian Campbell wrote a really good book about Bloody Sunday, and I interviewed about it. Yeah, so if anyone wants like the kind of play by play of the actual events, that's it. Um, we haven't put the episode out yet because we want to do it after Soldier F's trial is done, just in case there's any um just in case there's any attempt to like to maybe have it like affect the trial in some way. But David Burke and myself, and he's wrote about this before, so it's not new. But he theorizes that the reason they were there is because they had intel from like a very faulty informant about IRA activity that was going to happen that day, and the plan being was to draw them out, and that I think Soldier F that he was sent in. Uh, he shot a few civilians, and I think the that theory being that once he'd done that and drawn them out, then it kind of doesn't really matter. Once there's a shootout, then you can easily just say that those innocent people killed at the beginning were caught up in that, and it kind of gets lost in it. But then they
Yeah.
didn't come out, and that yeah. So there's all that, and it's a whole different subject on its own. Yeah. So it left the people of Ireland, the North, the world shocked. Obviously, particularly them. You mentioned the recruitment drive that it caused. It was literally one of the biggest, um, yeah, like one of the biggest recruitment tools that the Provos could even ask for. 72 also played host to Operation Motorman, which again was another one of these things that turned the population against the army, and it was kind of like a final nail in that coffin. Would you go into what Operation Motorman, the shape it took in Derry?
Yeah. So Motorman was designed. It was the biggest post-war operation up until that time carried out by the British Army, and the whole idea was to get rid of the no-go areas, specifically in Belfast and Derry. Derry's no-go area, so free Derry. There it was actually called Operation Car Can, and so on, but it goes under the motorman kind of umbrella, and the provisionals knew it was going to happen. They didn't know exactly when, but of course the British shipped over a whole range of engineering equipment, so big army diggers and bulldozers, as well as extra troops. They brought in thousands of extra troops, and there's you can't do that kind of secretly in a place as small as Northern Ireland. So they knew that was kind of on the cards, and also it was felt that it was going to happen at some point, because for any state to allow areas of its territory to be beyond the writ of normal law enforcement that's a tough one. That's a very, very difficult for any state to endure. And they thought this is we've got to go in. Funny, when I interviewed troops that were involved, their brief was very firmly, as you said yourself on for Bloody Sunday, was that this is going to be battles in the streets. This is going to the provisionals are going to stand and fight, and so we are going to be. They're all told wear your dog tags, because if you're then killed, we need to be able to identify you, and don't worry about all those body bags piled up in the corner there for you, because you're going to lose you're going to lose a lot of guys, and of course it turned out that's not what pretty much what provisionals have done before. For instance, before Bloody Sunday, is that they put the word out. We think this is going to happen. Get over the border. Get over the border to Donegal, so that in effect the army are kind of charging into thin air. Free Derry has done what we wanted it to do. It in a way it brought the issue to the sight of the world. It's done us an awful lot of good. It's going to go at some point. So there, and we're ready to go. But at the same time, it led to really what I think is one of the greatest tragedies of the Troubles, in in the county and the city, and something that has been forgotten, which is the Claudy, bombings. So early in the morning, British Army goes in, and they've been assigned what areas they're going to clear and all of the barricades and so on. They find that the vast majority of the provisionals have disappeared. There's a few shots fired to one volunteer who hadn't got the word, and so on. He was killed in a gun battle, and unfortunately, a young innocent civilian was also killed. He was also killed by the army. Tragic accident, but still a tragedy. But there wasn't the gun battles that they thought there was going to be. But at the same time, so a few miles outside Derry City, little village of Claudy. I mean, it's a lovely place. I've been there. It's typical small, village with a high street, church, and so on. A few shops, a couple of pubs, closed down hotel now. The Beaufort Hotel was there, but for obvious reasons now it's closed. And there's this kind of haunting memorial just off the high street, near a discount booze shop. Actually, funny enough. So, and it was the word got, OC of Derry put out. They South Derry units had prepped the bombs beforehand. They knew that Motorman car can for Derry was going to happen, and they needed a distraction. They need to upset the apple cart. They couldn't do that in the city, so they thought, well, what we're going to do is we're going to do it elsewhere in the county. Claudy was picked. It was a mixed community. It had been attacked before. The telephone exchange had been bombed. There'd been no real massive problems there, but yeah, in effect, the pretty much the entirety of South Derry IRA was involved in the operation. So the call came down from the brigade commander, McGuinness. Okay, thumbs up on the operation, and it then goes into place. So 3 cars, all stolen. Remote farmhouse bomb factory in Craigovole, loaded up with bombs into 3 different locations in Claudy, all close to each other, because you can't put them far away from each other because Claudy's not big enough to put them far away from each other. And then it was calling the warning, as they've done many times before, get everyone cleared out of the area. Commercial explosive, boom, blows up the post office, blows up hotel, blows up the petrol station, that type of thing. And they've made their point. They've distracted from Motorman and etc. And it just goes totally pear-shaped. And the volunteer detailed to phone in the warning. Phone box is gone, and it's because of course they and this is I still kind of struggle with, because they didn't kind of make errors like this very often, but they've been blowing up telephone exchanges, for the last year and a bit, and of course the state was repairing them, but at what pace, and you can't tell that type of thing. It hadn't been checked, so they can't phone in the warning. So they're then racing up the road to Dungiven, and so on. But the Dungiven telephone exchange has been blown up and not repaired yet. So they're running into shops, going, and the shops are saying we can't call anyone. So, and they're going, the only workable phone is the RUC station. Well, we're not going to go running in there. But they're shouting at the shop assistants, get to the run to the station, run to the IC barracks and tell them, bomb, you've got to clear out, Claude. It's too late. It's too late by then. And first one goes off, and the youngest victim, Catherine Eakin, who's 8 years old, she's cleaning the windows of a family's grocer's shop, gets killed. As does a lady who, her family owned a petrol station and the bar in the centre. She was serving a customer in the petrol station when she was killed. It's absolute chaos. And the RUC constable ushers the survivors and the injured off to what he thinks is a safe area, but it's actually where another bomb is. That then goes off because he gets them away from what they rightly thought was another bomb. But he's then putting them into the path of the second one. Bang, more dead, and injured. Third one then goes off. Luckily, no one killed or injured them, but by then the damage is done. 3 from the first bomb, 3 very, very badly injured, rushed to hospital. and all three died in relatively short order. And there were, two children, five Catholics, there's nine dead, so five Catholics, four Protestants, two children. I mean, it was just, and there were a lot of tragedies like Claudy, so it's difficult to pick out one. But one thing I must admit, I just struggle with was the fact that, and I totally understand why, but the provisionals disowned it and said no, it wasn't us. And I get why. I totally do, and I get that a load of mistakes were made, and so it wasn't intentional. They didn't go out to slaughter nine people, but the fact is they did. And they should have owned it. They should have owned it. But there you go.
I was gonna say like it's not even a good enough excuse to be like, oh yeah, well we were gonna phone in a warning, but like when you do that, you put people in the position where if the phone doesn't work or if they misunderstand the warning or whatever, like you don't get to kind of wash your hands of it now.
Yes. Yeah. Agreed.
It's probably my favorite chapter in the book was the one about these three the Balahi poster boys. I mean literal poster boys, Derry style. We're of course talking about Francis Hughes, who people will know of course from the hunger strike. Dominic McGlinchey, which people will probably know more for his INLA involvement and subsequent murder, and Ian Milne as well. Yeah, if you there was more too, but these main three. Can you talk to us about the South Derry, these three South Derry boys?
Well, again, when I was doing the book, I thought long and hard and talked to my publisher about it, about how do I talk about, do I include South Derry? Do I just talk about Derry City, or do I talk about South Derry as well? And I was really clear that I wanted to do both. Um, and, and of course, it's very difficult because South Derry operated a lot of the time, and these three guys were kind of the epitome of that. They operated fairly independently. So they weren't chop and changing. So you didn't get guys from, Dungiven and Balaki going on jobs in the Bogside operation. And you didn't get. I mean, there was one. I'm sure we'll come on to one of the Flemings who did, but that was, he was involved out in the county because of specific circumstances, and so on. But they just didn't interchange. If you were a volunteer in Derry City, you went on operations in Derry City, and if you were South Derry, you went on operations in South Derry. But there was a kind of fairly informal but a conjoined structure, and it was one of the and that relies in that regard. It's very much like Fermanagh, and East Tyrone and South Armagh. It's Republican families with tends to be Republican families with long traditions, operating in staunchly nationalist villages, and so on. And unlike their city brethren, their main enemy is, to be honest, just like it was in those locales, it's the RUC and it's the UDR. Not exclusively, but it's and the war in South Derry has a lot of parallels with Fermanagh, South Armagh. Well, so Fermanagh and East Tyrone in particular. Obviously, UDR didn't operate in South Armagh, much talks of geography and circumstances. And all those guys, Dominic McGlinchey and Francis Hughes and Ian Milner, they came from that sort of background. They all knew each other at school. They didn't knock around together, all three of them as best muckers, but they all kind of knew each other. Balaki, as I say in the book, it's not now. It was the closest thing that the county had to Kappa, East Tyrone's Kappa, or South Armagh's Crossmaglen, and so on. That kind of very kind of closed, isolated Republican stronghold that fear to walk there and fear to tread there if you dare, type of thing. Obviously, Seamus Heaney, kind of being there, kind of wrecked that. But for those three guys, they were, they had traditions in their families of Republican involvement. Francis Hughes, they were very different characters. And when I talked to Dominic's brother Sean, who is ex-mayor of Limavady now, and manager of Timber Merchant, and very nice guy. I mean, he was So when I interviewed him, that was the first time I'd ever been in a Sinn Féin office. I went into the Sinn Féin office in Dungiven, um, and yes, was met by the redoubtable Carol White, who she's the kind of office manager and runs the desk there, and she knew exactly who I was when I walked up, and I'd missed Sean. He'd been there, but then he had to go back to work. I asked her for directions, and she just looked at me, and there was a hint of a smile, and I knew then, oh, she's going to have fun with me now. She's going to have fun with me, and so she gave me directions to his business, well, to the place where he works, in the broadest Irish accent I have ever heard. I could understand about every fourth word, and she knew it. She absolutely knew it. She was just messing with me, and I thought, well, I'm never going to find. So I foolishly said, could you just repeat that? And then that was it. Big smart, and then I don't think the accent could get any broader, but it just did. And again, there was no way, but I couldn't ask a third time. So I just had to say, thank you very much. That's very kind. And I thought, I'm just going to drive around fairly aimlessly until I can hopefully find this place, which luckily I did. And so on. But no, she was definitely having fun at my expense. But yeah, I talked to Sean about his brother, and the three, Dominic was the real planner. And he was very much hands-on. He liked to be at the sharp end. He famously said himself that he liked to be in literally for the kill, and he wanted to do it at close quarters because he didn't have the training to do a snipe from long distance. He wasn't good at that. He wanted to be close in so that way he would have he'd have the advantage. Um, Ian was slightly because Francis Hughes was the kind of the youngest of the three. Ian was a bit of a thinker as well, and could challenge Dominic on his thinking and his ideas behind operations and so on and so on. And Hughes was just action man, action boy. Loved guns, was very good with them, and so on, and really wanted to be involved. And there was, the three of them. There's a lot of kind of stuff talked about them, and they at first formed an independent, IRA unit called the Unrepentance or something like that. And I've never bought into that because if they were an independent IRA, they're the only independent IRA unit I've ever heard about, and I'm not sure how you can be an independent IRA unit. And it's things like where'd you get the guns from? Where'd you get the explosives? Where'd you get the ammunition? Where'd you get the training? And so on. It just doesn't hold. And Sean McGuinness was absolutely, he said that's all a load of rubbish. They joined, and they were in. They were simple as that. And of course he was a member with them, and so on. And it was the pace of operations that they were involved in, which was really made the difference in that they were just on job after job after job after job. And there was there was, as you rightly said, there was a cohort of other volunteers around them. They were not, but Sean, obviously, Dominic's brother Sean as well, cousin, Tom McAlwee, so Francis Hughes is his cousin. Lots of them. Hugh McCorrick. There's loads of guys there. I say loads of guys, 20, 25, and what have you. But those three really came to prominence, and they worked with a whole range of other volunteers to carry out operations. But firmly, the three of them were the kind of the very much the driving force of operations there, and they really were at it. 5 UDR was the local UDR battalion, and off-duty soldiers were always a threat. I mean, David McQuillian, who lived in Balaki himself with his family. I mean, how? I mean, I get that for people to go, this is my home, this is where I live, but the danger, the threat of being in that location, being a part-time UDR man, maybe it's just me, but I'd kind of say discretion's a better part of valor on that one, and I'd look to move. But they were very, very involved. Under vehicle booby trap bombs were a speciality. So there was Kerr, who was second lieutenant in 5 UDR, and that was he's taking his escort out of the out of the garage in the morning. Walter Kerr, that was it, and he died, and it was just a range of attacks, and then the famous, again, wrong articulation, apologies, but famous incident of Moneymore with the RUC police constables who cut off by a car, and they're in an unmarked vehicle, and of course they're just thinking, blimey, this is just some guy not paying attention. We'll pull him over, give him a ticking off, and off they go. And of course it's not. It's South Derry Pirate in there who just see they're getting chased by this car that puts the blue light on, and next thing you know, they're stop the car. Police stop as well. Automatic gunfire, which kills Ken Sheehan, RUC constable, and mortally wounds another. And it's just chaos. And then those guys are. It was later. Special branch were fairly clear that Francis Hughes was one of the three volunteers in the car, and Dominic McGlinchey was almost certainly the other gunman in the vehicle, and there was a driver. But they then got away, etc. But by this stage, they'd really turned South Derry into a bit of a killing ground, and the powers that be within the movement said, you've got to, we need everything to quieten down here, guys. So you need to head off, send them to your part of the world, John. Send them to York, where amazingly they got into trouble quite quickly. Got involved in a local dispute, and then went back and went straight to. And it was then, what are they going to do? And Dominic McGlinchey, he was starting to feel the constraints of operating as he did. He very much saw, to coin a phrase, it was South Derry first. He wasn't a big fan of being told what to do by the City Brigade commanders, and he also, they weren't getting the weapons and equipment that they thought they should have for the war they wanted to fight. He looked on like to South Armagh and said, they're getting all the gear. Why aren't we? And then it started, obviously, his long kind of journey into the IRA and how all that turned out, and so on, and the tragedy that engulfed his family. And then for Milner, it was a case of, I've got to get out of this area. It's too hot. So he heads off with another local volunteer, and goes to North Armagh, and the two of them are caught armed in a vehicle checkpoint in there, and he's arrested, and he's convicted, murder and so on, and sent away. But Francis Hughes is still around, and in those circumstances, you might think that, and most individuals and volunteers would say, right, I'm going to dial it down now, calm it down. And of course, he doesn't at all. If anything, he just accelerates, and continues to carry out one, obviously, which leads to tragedy with a young girl killed. Obviously, which again, he should have known, because the father would always take his two kids to school. So it was a regular occurrence. It wasn't a one-off. So, but yeah. So the boy in the back survived, but unfortunately the girl in the front didn't. And then he's a court in one of the most, again, as always with Francis Hughes, it's so many things around his career, if I can call it that, is so well known. It's like, why did he become? We were talking earlier, John, about whether was there a trigger for Martin McGuinness joining, and the big one always talk about Francis Hughes is he's coming back from going to a drinks in Ardbow, stopped by a UDR patrol. They realise he's from a Republican family. They give him a kicking. He then goes home. His dad says, report it to the police. He says, no, I'll get them back in my own way. And is that true? And Sean McGlinchey says it is true. And he said, that was standard practice for what the UDR would do to us. And that pretty much tipped him tipped him over into what he became. But even his capture. And it was a former SAS guy who was serving in Northern Ireland at the time, wasn't on that job, but was there at the time and said, yeah, we've been given some intelligence by 14 Company that he was going to this house. We've been sitting on the job. Well, other guys have been sitting on the job for 2 days. They came back and said, load of rubbish. Been left here, absolutely nothing going on. If you want to go and sit on it, you go and sit on it. So 14 Intelligence put 2 operators out there. And then they saw these 2 guys coming towards them carrying weapons, wearing military fatigues, and assumed they were members of the UDR. Challenged them. Francis Hughes was the lead guy. He opened fire immediately, mortally wounded one of the operators and hit the other one quite badly, but got caught himself in gunfire from the second one. Somehow managed to crawl away quite a distance, actually, which he must have been in agony. Because, of course, when he was caught the next day, which was St. Patrick's Day, as luck would have it, well, that was like, yeah. So when he was caught, they had to operate to save his leg, and they had to cut 1.5 inches off his femur to save the leg, and he was in recovery for months. So I mean, how he managed to both crawl and then didn't die from blood loss. But that was him, and of course that meant all 3 of them, because by this time Dominic McGuinness was in prison in the south. So the 3 of them are gone, because after the wanted poster was put up after the Moneymore RUC shootings, and I mean, incredible thing. I mean, that in a modern state, because it is a wanted poster is, it's a western. It's John Wayne, wanted, dead or alive. Oh, they're on the back of that horse type of thing. It's like not what you expect in the late 1970s. In Northern Ireland. It's just amazing, really. But yeah, and when the 3 of them kind of got taken out of the picture, that really, South Derry Power never really recovered from that. Carried on, and so on. I don't want to say in any way that they just suddenly stopped, because they didn't. But they were never the same force again that they were. Because I mean, and that was, we can talk about, the loss of, for East Tyrone. It was a lot. It was Lot Gall, loss of the A team. So Jim Liner and Podrick McKinney and Paddy Kelly. For Manor, it was Seamus McElwain, and so on. There are these individuals who, particularly in rural areas, dominate their sphere, and once they've gone, really, they are irreplaceable. Really, I mean, funny enough, the only place that never happened to for very different was South Armagh. So out of all of the rural kind of setups, South Armagh never suffered a Lot Gall, Seamus McElwain or a wanted 3. So
I was going to say, yeah, on South Armagh, it really is like it really is extraordinary that, like, I think like 8, it was like 8 in the whole conflict were killed, and like a few, like a small few locked up. Considering this is the place responsible for 1 in every 5 British military deaths. Those 2 are like way out of proportion. You would think it would match it more. Now this I think is probably attributable to their like carefulness. They didn't do these like unbelievably risky, ballsy East Tyrone stuff like the way we spectaculars or set pieces where the potential rewards are enormous when you have all your top lads on a job like this. But then of course if your eggs are all in one basket, and if the basket gets shot, then yeah. Okay, yeah, so yeah, that's South Derry. Yeah, those 3. I was literally about to say it. Yeah, they're very much like the A team of up there. Okay, so just in the meantime, that was 78. Martin McGuinness spent, I think, 6 months in the Curragh at the end of 72.
yeah,
Uh, yeah, he was. Yeah, he was in prison, not in the north. It was just membership. One small thing on the accent, right? So this is becoming a tradition. When you write a book about a place, I then discover a boxer from that place. So the last time was Fergal McCrory, and then at his last fight, which was epic, was mental. It was in Madison Square Garden just before Paddy's Day. There's a young fella from Derry named Donna Keary, and he made his debut that night. And you were saying about the accent. So he fought like way earlier in the night. So I think he was kind of sitting down with his friends and stuff, and they were like 2 or 3 rows ahead of me. And I was there with a few friends, with one of them being a fella from the Bronx, but never heard a Derry accent in his life. And one of your man's friends turned around to him to ask him for a chewing gum, and had to ask him literally 4 or 5 times. And your man, he just did that thing where you don't know, he just laughed. You laugh and not, and I'm like, yeah, he wants a chewing gum there. So yeah, that was funny. You mentioned about the accent. Okay, so. The SAS officially were brought into the north following Kingsmill. They had been like attached to other kind of units and stuff, but in terms of like a proper deployment, it wasn't until the kind of mid 70s. You might
Yeah.
talk just about about like these first SAS actions in Derry. I'm thinking particularly in November 78 of a man named Patsy Duffy.
There's always this kind of the bogeyman for the Republicans, and this belief that there's just thousands of them. So, but of course, for the early 70s, I mean, it's always been a small unit, and they were fighting in Oman, in Dhofar. That's where they were, in the Jebels and what have you, with fighting the tribesmen, and very much focused on it. Northern Ireland was a world away, and previous to that, they'd always been used, in Malaya and Borneo. So we're talking, thousands of miles away from home, out of sight, and so on. That's the way they were used. They were never envisaged to be kind of, almost a homegrown counterinsurgency piece in a what was considered obviously a part of the United Kingdom. It just wasn't. So, and when Wilson, as the Prime Minister, publicly said, "Right, well, I'm going to deploy them because of all of these," he said, right, they were caught absolutely by surprise, and they were like saying, "Well, who are we going to send? Because there's literally no one here." And from then onwards, they tended to be in kind of dribs and drabs, and lots of them left after Dhofar. That typically happens after a war. You get lots of individuals in various units who fought it leaving because they've kind of done their war, and they just feel. I mean, and not just the British. It happens across a range of armies. Individuals fight a war and they say, "Done my bit now. I've done that. I'm gonna move off and do something else." Um, so there was a big lack of transfer of knowledge and hardly any numbers, and it's how were they going to be involved? And of course, they're all of a sudden they're not used to strict rules of engagement governed by English law, because where they've been operating in the jungles of Malaya and Borneo and Dhofar and so on, there is no writ of British law. And so on. You're in a combat environment, and so you act accordingly. That is not what Northern Ireland was. And that gave them some real issues. They weren't trained for it. Psychologically, they weren't really kind of ready for it. And it led to, and they were called in as in effect the kind of the kill team, if I can put it like that. Of course, they carry out an awful lot of surveillance and so on. So it's not that every single operation that they were sent on, to watch a weapons hide or whatever was a kill or arrest operation. A lot of it was just surveillance because they're very, very good at that. But they were also very much tasked with kind of lethal intervention, if I can put it like that. So 14 Intelligence Company was not. They were there for surveillance. And when they were involved and people got killed, it was not the aim of the operation, and so on. It was a surveillance that went wrong. So Francis Hughes's case and so on, when one of them was killed, they weren't there to shoot Francis Hughes and so on. They were there for surveillance, to call in a team and potentially have him arrested. So hence why the surprise when there was fire and one of them got killed. And of course, in the city, in Derry, yes, it's how do we get involved in all of this? And they had, for them, it was tended to be, I mean, their later operations, Grantchester, which we'll come on to, I'm sure, Grantchester Hospital, and so on. Those were specific operations, but the early days ones was, yes, it was we're looking over a weapons cache. Individual and circumstance comes to kind of pick up the weapons, and so on, and then it's the classic. It all goes automatic rattle of fire very very quickly, and it was SAS troopers saying, he moved in a threatening manner. I thought my life and the life of my colleagues was in danger, and I took lethal action. And of course, for Republicans, it's proof positive of the shoot to kill policy that the SAS is very much the kind of the poster boy for, in terms of, as if you'll go into that situation, then there's no justification. You are going to get killed by the SAS. Now, again, you can argue to your blue face on either way, and everyone kind of does. There is no definitive. I would say that in a lot of operations, and I was never involved in any of them, so I can't say anything from first-hand a viewpoint. But I would say a lot of those operations that, yes, there was a threat or a perceived threat involved, and so you then act as you do to resolve it by shooting them dead. Because we all know, we've said this plenty of times before, is disarming someone or shooting to wound is for the birds. It isn't real, and so on. If you shoot to wound, it's because you've missed. To be honest, the Hollywood Western, you shoot the gun out of their hand and then they're just standing there, bleeding slightly, and so on. It's just, exactly. It doesn't. You shoot for center of body mass, and you continue to fire until they pose no more threat, and that might take 20 bullets until you're absolutely sure. And as they always say, it's better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. Which is a horrible truism, but it's a truism for a reason, and so on. So don't make a mistake, and if in doubt, put them down.
The SAS wouldn't get another kill in Derry after that for another 6 years. You actually mentioned in the book, it was quite interesting that this Patsy Duffy's shooting would actually end up having like a huge knock-on effect on the effect of East Tyrone.
There've been the Ballysillan shootings in Belfast very recently before Patsy Duffy. So where SAS ambush 3 guys carrying fire bombs. They were Ardoyne volunteers, and they were shot dead in an SAS ambush. But a passerby, I was about to say innocent, but it turned out the guy was in the UVF. So not exactly innocent, say least. But at the time he wasn't involved in the ambush. He was literally a passerby. He just happened to be in the UVF. I mean, circumstances. But of course, those guys have been killed, and the police in particular. Jack Herman was the assistant chief constable of the RUC, and he was like saying, "This is too, there's too much room for error here, and I do not want guys with automatic weapons running around my cities, causing mayhem and killing innocent civilians, and this is not where I want them to be." So he sits down with Dick Trant, who's Commander Land Forces Northern Ireland, and says, "Look, don't want it. Police primacy is very much in charge." So Jack Herman's got the whip hand over Trant as the army general, and he says, and Trant's going, "Well, where else do you want me to put them then?" He said, "Well, go in the countryside. There's loads of it. Go out there. That'll be absolutely fine." And so on. Chances of innocent passers-by getting hit is far less. And of course, that then starts the process of, well, where are they going to be deployed? And as we said before, South Armagh just doesn't have, for a variety of reasons, isn't the right place. It doesn't have the local intelligence that's necessary to guide those operations. It just so happens that East Tyrone does, and so over a period of time, it's the SS happenstance more than anything else becomes more and more focused on East Tyrone, and yeah, over a period of years, almost wipes them out.
Okay, so let me take us to um, uh, an incident where two Derry ASU members were taken out, one wounded, and there's some controversy around. Sorry, this is May 28th, 81. Apparently, the story is that the two killings and one wounding were done by one det operator who fired, I think, like what, a dozen shots, five of which hitting
Yeah.
on the guys. I don't know. I wasn't there or nothing. That does sound like they must have been an amazing kind of operator to be able to do that just on his own. Yeah, tell us about that incident, please.
Yeah, that was Paul Oram. He was a sergeant from the cavalry, who'd obviously done debt selection. Got in, was a well-known operator there, and he was in a Q car. And a Q car is a modified civilian car, so it looks perfectly normal. There's a bit of armor plating in the kind of the doors, so but not much because they don't want it too heavy. And so a lot of the time they'd also put some in the headrest behind, so if they get shot in the head. So, and it would have a radio in it with an aerial running around inside in the lining of the roof panel, so you couldn't see it, and you trigger it by you could trigger it either by kind of a foot pedal in the footwell or a button on the handbrake. So everything looked perfectly normal. You'd be armed, obviously. Usually, just sit on your, be sitting on your pistol, and the idea is that you do it for surveillance. I mean, 14 company were there for surveillance, vehicle and foot, and to provide all of that intelligence that was needed to launch operations. And he was on a uh, uh, normal job, observation job, and he got done by IRA dickers. They'd see, and that had happened before. So Alan Swift, who'd been another member of the Det, he'd been dicked a few years before, and an IRA team had quickly hijacked a car, grabbed some weapons from a cache, found him, put in the ambush, killed him, and so in those circumstances, 14 company operators had undergone a tremendous amount of kind of training to ensure that they weren't going to be subject to the same circumstance. And yeah, the team that was put in was led by the ASU was George McBrearty, who was a very, very well known member of Derry City, Derry City Pyra, and Pop Maguire was with him, and so on, and Peggy McCourt, and the driver, and the whole idea was, yes, they were going to ambush this guy, and do to him what they'd done to Alan Swift, and Paul Oram got the drop on them, and again, as with almost every kind of fatality of the sort, it's in the eye of the beholder as to what you want to believe. I.e., if you're kind of the view of the security forces, yes, it was a legitimate kind of operation. You go, yes, it was just Paul Oram by himself with a Browning 9mm, and he was very, very well trained, and also a certain amount of luck. And yes, the operation went off, and he shot dead two members of the IRA, and severely wounded another. Or if you're from the other side of the fence, you go bull. I call bull on that one, and say there's clearly a lot more individuals involved in cars. There's witnesses that said they saw, 5 people and 3 cars and what have you. Either way, I always think in these circumstances there is nothing that one side could say to the other that would change their minds. People believe what they kind of want to believe. I think for me, the upshot is that it left 2 senior volunteers dead and another one severely wounded, and then he was kind of captured because, of course, they couldn't actually take him over the border because he was bleeding out. So they take him to Alton Gelvin Hospital, saved his life, but obviously that means he's caught. So that ASU is then gone. I mean, I spoke to Danny McBrearty, who's one of George's brothers, very, very briefly when I was researching the book, and understandably so, he does not want he doesn't like to talk about it because it's he was very close to his brother, thought the world of him, and he was very clear because it was the SAS executed my brother. Simple as that. And he didn't want to say any more, and I wasn't going to press him. It's so I absolutely get that. But for the city, because the fact of the matter is that Derry City provisionals, just like South Derry, we're not talking about hundreds of people. We're talking a couple of dozen of volunteers who are prepared to pull a trigger or press a button. There's lots of others who will help them. They might provide a hide, they might move a weapon, they might drive a car, they might do anything like that. But the operators, as the volunteers themselves call those who are at the forefront, they're few and far between. And the likes of George McBrearty was what I mean. George McBrearty was along with Martin McGuinness, were the very first two guys to put under 7-day detention orders when Roy Mason brought those in. And Dennis Foyle, who's father Dennis Foyle, is well known throughout the Troubles as being a campaigner, once called the McBrearty household the most raided house in the 6 counties. And yeah, that was a genuine. And it wasn't the only incident that Paul Oram was involved in. I mean, Peter Taylor writes about him being involved in the fatal shooting of an IRA guy as well. So he got around, and of course, tragically, he then was on the other end of it later in Dunloy, up in North Antrim, where he was on a surveillance job out in the country, not in the city, and there was an ASU, local ASU, Henry Hogan, I think was one of them, and so on, and yeah, gunfight, and 2 provisional volunteers were killed in the gunfight, and Oram was also killed. So it kind of ended here. But I mean, definitely an individual who always seemed to be at the epicenter of events.
You mentioned there one stage in the book was a very interesting point that obviously once the IRA adopted this kind of 4 or 5 man ASU structure, cell structure, whatever you want to call it, as opposed to the more classic kind of military one. You said it actually didn't suit Derry quite as well as it did Belfast.
I mean, I totally get why, because it was a Jerry Adams initiative, to move away from the company, battalion, and kind of classic brigade structure that the provisionals had been formed on, because that was how the IRA had always been structured. Moved to an ASU setup, and it worked in Belfast, because Belfast is big, as everyone knows. So it means that for a small team, they can operate kind of separately from each other, because the distances and the things, it's not cheap by jowl. And it worked to a large degree in rural areas as well, because rural areas had always been tight knit. You wouldn't get East Tyrone IRA drilling in the local, church hall, 20 of them all together and calling themselves the, 3rd Company, 4th Battalion, East Tyrone Brigade, or whatever. It was, they operated in small teams naturally that suited their terrain, and their family bonds and friendships, the equipment they had, and so on and so on. So really, for the rural units, the ASU was just formalising the structure that they operated in. Famously, South Armagh didn't. It kept a battalion structure, but that was different setup. But Derry just isn't. It's not rural. So for South Derry, it worked absolutely fine, just like it did for Manor and East Tyrone, as we said. But Derry's just not big enough. It's a city, but it's not. It's not Belfast, and it just meant that those people, and particularly because for most of them, they're not even across all of the city. They're just on the West Bank. So yes, there's an ASU in the Gobner scale, Waterside on the East Bank, but there's a vast majority of them based on the West Bank, and they're all pretty close to each other. And you're going to know each other. You cannot get away from it. It is. I mean, I wonder. I mean, when I went over there for research trips, I'd wonder, from from the river and go into the Bogside, wander around the Bogside, and then up walk up the hill into Craigan, and then over to the east of Chantallow. And you just can't. Yeah, you're thinking they'll know each other here, and that's exactly what it was. And what that meant, of course, was that you know it it, it sounded a good idea, the ASUs for somewhere like Derry, but it didn't work. Well, it worked. So I'll rephrase that. It worked as long as you didn't have informers. But the moment you get informers, and the reality of the modern Irish conflict stretching back to 1916 and well before even that and so on, is that the informer is ever present in the conflict. They just are, and they should have, the provisionals should have foreseen that and worked out a way of, right, horses for courses, what works in Derry, because that's what, and they just didn't. And I don't really know why. I'd be fascinated to understand why they didn't consider that it wasn't suited for the city that they were operating in, because it just meant that a relatively small number of people knew pretty much the entire network. And so if they started to talk, if any one of them started to talk, then my goodness, you'd be in real trouble.
We'll get to SAS actions in Derry against the IRA, and we'll get to the number of informers. There's a few like some of the most prolific informers from the whole conflict were Derry involved. Just before that, you went through a few things in the book that lessened public support for the Derry IRA. Some of them were things that the IRA themselves doing. For example, what was his name? Joanne Mathers killing, yeah, really didn't help. There was also the fact that like the housing, like thank God the allocation of housing issue, I would maybe not sorted, but wasn't. It was kind of sorted to a degree, so it wasn't like as much of a force driving. So yeah, could you go through some of these things that took from the public support that a guerrilla army like absolutely needs? It's like oxygen for a guerrilla army.
I haven't really checked. It wasn't a case of, oh, they built a few new houses, few more jobs, and then everyone went, oh well, what was the problem anyway? Let's all move. Yeah, we've got this one person, one vote now, so it's not no dramas. But that did make a significant difference, because a lot of those things have started to happen. Like the voting stuff had been pretty much sorted in the 70s, and so all of that idea of the gerrymandering and the corporation vote and so on, so unequal distribution of votes had pretty much disappeared, and that left so it meant local people had a voice in what was going on. Money was flowing into the city, so yes, lots of the old decrepit housing was knocked down and new stuff put up, and we're not talking about it's not Blenheim Palace or whatever, but my God, it's a hell of a lot better than was there before. And, it's got indoor plumbing, and you don't have to go outside to sort yourself out. And that makes a huge difference. And by removing those immediate grievances where that you could see every day as a resident, and so on, that goes a long way. And you go, maybe there's a future here. Maybe and it doesn't get talked about enough, I think, because it's not the violent stuff, but classic counterinsurgency is remove the reasons why the local people are going to support the guerrillas, stroke paramilitaries, and whatever. You remove those, you're going to remove a lot of support from them, and so the economic and social and political stuff counts an awful lot, and it really does. It's someone like Derry where everything really started, it sprang out of that inequality. You remove a bunch of the inequality, then all of a sudden people start to feel kind of a lot better, kind of about themselves, and that's just a huge, and yes, the provisionals start to do not start to do because they've done them previously, but they do some high profile things which just volunteers that I interviewed for the book just couldn't fathom. And funny enough, this happened from then onwards. They made mistakes earlier, but almost you could say a lot of their mistakes could be put down to lack of training, lack of experience, and so on. But by the beginning of the 80s, we're not, they'd been at this a long time, and they knew what they were doing. And something like the killing of Joanne Mathers, and you just look at it in any context, and you've got to struggle to see how anyone could order that.
For anyone who hasn't read the book, you might fill us in a little bit.
So obviously 81, it was early 81, and of course the main thing that was going on was the hunger strikes, which were dominating in the way they were like Bloody Sunday was the point of the 70s in lots of ways. The hunger strikes were the point of the 80s. You can see that in lots of ways. And the hunger strikes. So Bobby Sands and his compatriots on hunger strike. It's causing just incredible tension, and at the same time, there's bureaucracy moves on. So there's there's the poll, there's the census that happens every 10 years. So census forms are delivered, and everyone's got to fill them out at the same time, so the state can capture all the information about who lives where and how many people there are, so they can work out what services need to be delivered to who and where. And they're all meant to be brought in, and they're collected by people called enumerators. And normally in Northern Ireland, all the enumerators had been the police, but given the circumstances, that wasn't considered to be a good idea. So this time they're going to be civilians, and one of the civilians, and they were, these people weren't full-time enumerators. Obviously, they only had a job every 10 years. So they just advertised in papers, and you went through a selection process, and there was 160 quid if you got picked, and you were given an area, and then you went around and you picked up the forms and brought them back in and so on. Joanne Mathers, originally from Donegal, just over the border. She'd married a local Derry farmer called Lowry, and she was a town planner by training. But she got pregnant with their first son and given up her job. Shane was born to look after him. And her husband was a dairy farmer and working very hard, but she thought, I'll help out the family finances. Of course, do a few quid. I'll do enumeration. And the provisionals have put out a call saying we're going to boycott. We want the census boycotted in solidarity with the hunger strikers. And of course, but Mrs. Mathers is going about her job, and she's going around the Gomme scale of an evening collecting the forms, and she's on, is it Anderson Crescent? I can't remember. Doesn't actually matter. But and she goes to one door where she's roundly abused and told to sod off and all this type of stuff, and very aggressively. And she bursts into tears. She's a young mother and so on. And then she goes and knocks on the next door, and the lady of the house, she's there with her son, gets her water and calms her down, and then says, my son, he'll show you point out the good houses in the area where you'll be fine. So she goes she goes, thank you very much, goes to the first one of those, and she knocks on the door, householder comes, and then from behind her, gunman appears and shoots her. Doesn't kill her, wounds her. She almost kind of falls into the house. That the householder, to be credit, then tries to keep the gunman out, closes an internal glass door to try and keep this guy out. The guy just bashes through the glass door. Mrs. Mathers is on the floor, and he shoots her twice and kills her. Grabs a handful of the forms and runs. And she's dead. I spoke to her husband Lowry over the telephone. I didn't want to obviously go to his farm without an invitation. A very, very simple, polite man, still a working dairy farmer. All he said, he didn't want to speak about it in any length. Completely understand. It's still obviously incredibly raw. and he said it helps to keep him busy, keep busy, keep his mind off it. But he's clearly never recovered, and he was very open about it. Never recovered from it. And why anyone would think that that was a blow to the state or anything apart from the cold blooded murder of an unarmed young woman. I mean, not wearing. I mean, it's not the uniform. They always say when the traditional Republican kind of piece when they shoot someone kind of off duty, where they say it's not their religion, it's the uniform and so on. And I do have some sympathy for that. I do, when I say sympathy, I understand it to an extent and so on. But this wasn't anyone who was in a uniform. She wasn't an RUC reservist. She wasn't a Greenfinch part-time UDR or anything. She was, a stay-at-home mum earning a few quid collecting census forms, and that really did strike home among a lot of Derry residents who started then. And this goes back to the earlier point about the ASUs, because one of the other things that the move to ASUs did was, yes, it improved security for much of the IRA infrastructure by moving them kind of into the shadows and away from the glare of security force vision. But that also meant that they weren't visible to their own community anymore, and they're just not there. So when before and as we talked, the Wild West style gun battles in the street, you can kind of, locals could see them and say they're fighting for us, taking risks for us in the street and so on. Whereas now they wouldn't see that, and they disappeared from view for totally understandable reasons. But then they become, a force in the shadows, and that's a real problem for them in terms of opinion.
Yeah, this kind of, you said in the book that People's Army image is much tougher to maintain when you're not like literally, if you're in the streets actually defending the very streets, like, yeah, of course people will support you. Okay, other we have a few other things to get to, but yeah, in terms of other actions taken by the IRA that ended up like damaging their support. There's of course the Craigens, the Good Neighbor bomb, that the people can read about. There was the use of proxy bombs. In particular, there was one man who was forced. I think he took up work at like some army base.
Mentioned it before, but didn't actually follow through I think it was my fault. It was these actions started. There's always actions that would happen. So the Good Neighbor bomb is a classic. Which was it was a come on, and so that they kidnapped the flat owner, who was a petty criminal, and so on. Put in a device. So the idea was lure the security forces in. They go and investigate what happened to this guy. Bang, gone. But it didn't work, and so on, because some of his neighbours, he'd gone for a couple of days, and they were worried about him. So they went to check on him, and they initiated it back. Now, that had happened before in terms of individual being killed, and it was a young lad in, I think it was the Craigen rather than the Bogside. Apologies, I cannot remember. In some ways it doesn't matter. It's a tragedy either way. They put in a small device, provisional put in a small device, and then they called a hoax or whatever to bring the security force presence in. The security force come round, and the whole idea, they then bang, done to a tripwire, it to then go off. They searched the area and actually found it, let alone set the thing off. And then they're gone. And then a local lad just playing went, oh, I'll go and see what all of this furore is about. So he then goes, tripwire, and he's killed. And so that had happened. So these things had happened before. But the 80s was a real sea change. We said because the social and economic change, it fell on different ground. And these things seem to be happening more and more, and it was a question that when I was talking to interviewing volunteers, they were, a lot of the time they were saying, was this part of a plan? Like, was this just coincidence that things like Joanne Mathers were happening, and the Good Neighbors bomb and so on and the proxy bombs. I mean, proxy bombs have been going on for for quite a while, and they changed over time. So the idea is that you take over someone's house, almost certainly someone who had access to a security force base or whatever, and it's like the old take the bank manager's family, hostage, and then get them to help you rob the bank. And then they load up the car with a bomb, get them to drive it in, and then they run out going bomb, bloody bomb, and then bang, it goes off and causes a lot of damage. Hopefully, causes some security force casualties, in the views of the operation. But by this stage in Derry, they refined it, and I remember being trained actually in the technique to handle it. We were specific proxy bombs because what you will find is that the driver who will be innocent will either be tied into the passenger seat or in some circumstances chained. And so what we used to have was that the first guy on a permanent vehicle checkpoint and what have you would so they would be the only one guy would go up. So we'd only have one individual. So if worst comes to the worst, there's only one person that's caught in the blast. But they were given a bloody big sharp knife to cut rope if necessary, but also a pair of clippers to do the chains. But we were specifically trained. You did one go, one quick shot at it, and if you couldn't do it first off, then you ran like buggery and got into hard cover. So you didn't just carry on and on and on because they, it would just provisionals would almost certainly trigger the bomb. So you had one go of getting this guy out, and if it didn't work, it was get into cover, and that's just. And so they carried out a whole series in a series of 3 attacks, but the worst one, and for Derry, made a huge difference was Patsy Gillespie. So local Catholic family, living in the Craigan, I think, rather than the Bogside, and he was a cleaner at the local army base, and he'd been doing it for a long time. It's not like he'd just taken it up. He'd been doing that job for quite a while. Again, I talked to interviewed a former volunteer who said, I don't understand why that job was okay. We know that he'd been doing that for a couple of years. We told him to stop and he hadn't because his family were desperately short of money. And it was, and it was a steady job. And it paid the bills and so on. And so they'd taken his family hostage. They chained him to take him over the border, put him in a van, take him to the permanent vehicle checkpoint. It was King's Regiment that were there. He shouted, bomb, bomb, bomb. They tried once quickly, but then bang, off it went. And it was the awfulness of it was that in the aftermath, I think killed 5 or 6 soldiers. But in the aftermath, the security forces put out an alert to search for Patsy Gillespie because he was implicated as the driver. So they said, and he's not at the scene. So he's got away. This guy's obviously, and then they, Soccos did their deep forensic examination, and they went, he is here, just in very, very, very small pieces, and that's just, and of course they're a Catholic family. Everyone knew them. And so on. And again, it was. I mean, local people, of course, wouldn't be happy about the job that he was doing, but they kind of understood. Family to provide for, food on the table, and this was what happened. And of course, and again, it just fed into that narrative that this by now unknown kind of secret army of the shadows. Who are they doing this for? Because they're seemingly not doing it for us. Because they're blowing up people like Patsy Gillespie, who's one of us, and that's not an accident. They atomized him, and they knew entirely what they were doing. And it's just that's a
in a similar vein to we'll say like the decline of the Derry IRA. You might talk us through 2 of these SAS ambushes. One in 1984. No, sorry, they were only they were like a week apart. December '84, Drum Rush, County Fermanagh, the first one. They were only 2 months after the Brighton bomb. Apparently, the famous ex-SAS author Andy McNabb was on the job. Two IRA and one British soldier killed. Yeah, you might talk about that, and then of course six days later, a relative of one of the IRA men killed in that attack is killed in
That's
that
correct.
as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was yeah, as we said before, the SAS had really taken a back seat. In Derry for a long time. Hadn't been involved. Had been focusing very firmly on, East Tyrone and other parts of the province. But then, yeah, drum rush on the border. So it was really a South Derry operation. It was one of those few operations where a Derry city volunteer, was also involved. One of the Flemings, and that was because he'd been involved in the Maze breakout, and then couldn't go back to city. He'd be picked up in no time at all. So we then linked up with kind of South Derry, and was operating with them. And it was a classic come on operation. So restaurants. So the idea being that they would call in a bomb attack, saying we have to firebomb at this restaurant, basically near the border, and then they would get them. They piled a load of explosives in the culvert under the road. So with security force response, when they arrived, firing point, boom, and operation successful, and away we go. And then across the border back into Donegal. Freezing cold night, absolutely thick fog everywhere. Um, by that stage, informers had been doing an awful lot. So information being passed to security forces that this was going on, and gave them enough time just to mount an operation. So SAS teams down there, absolute nightmare, just trying to navigate in the fog and get there, freezing. The roads are icy, and the provisional team are waiting. There's quite a bit of confusion in the reports about who was there and when. Totally understandably, considering it was pitch black and incredibly foggy, and so on, and everyone's trying to stay hidden and quiet. So there was reports that an RUC vehicle was there and then somehow disappeared, and then the SAS arrived. Difficult to see that that's true, because if an RUC vehicle had arrived, the provisionals would have initiated the ambush. I'm absolutely sure. I mean, they're not going to pick who they're going to go for. If an RUC vehicle arrives, there's security force response, bang, success. But again, as these operations do, it just so happened that one of the SAS vehicles, they're civilianized vehicles, I mean, not army Land Rovers or anything like that, basically pulled up, and troopers got out right next to the firing point, where the most of the ambush team are sitting waiting. And then it just starts to dissolve into utter confusion. One of the provisional team is waiting in a for the get out car. He's giving them the go ahead, saying go. The security forces are here. He does that. It doesn't work. They press the button. It doesn't happen. Clearly, something has gone wrong with it, and that happens on operations. It can't have been security force activity, because, of course, it hadn't been in situ for long enough for any operation to be placed against it. But so total confusion all round. There's SAS wandering around, going, what's happening. Then there's one of them puts up what we call what the army calls a schmoolie, which is a parachute flare. You see them in all the films. Shoots them in the sky, lights up, thousands and thousands of candle power, floats slowly down on a parachute. You can see things. It's all very ghostly, and apocalypse now, and all this type of stuff. And of course, there's the volunteers at the firing point see in front of them. Remember, the Crown Forces happen to be an SAS soldier, so they open fire. Kill him. His mates are running back, going, "What the hell's going on?" They see who they assume to be, obviously, a volunteer, who's Anthony Magola Bride. He gets shot and killed in the altercation. Again, there's lots of controversy over that. Did he Was he ran? Did they then shoot him as he ran, or they brought him back? Did he then? I think the official version is that he then grabbed one of their weapons and was then shot. But again, it's the usual controversy between the one side saying one thing, the other saying the other, and so on. And there the twain, will meet. But the rest of the ASU then split. They head off into the dark, just trying to get away from a sudden gun battle, which they didn't expect, and they were just not prepared for. And they, unfortunately, found out later that they tried to cross the river, swollen by winter rain this time, to get away from the cold. They'd each wearing, thick coats, about 14 layers of vests and jumpers and God knows what else. And unfortunately, the Fleming lad, he couldn't swim and got swept away. And the other two made it; they got over. They were then picked up kind of later on the Irish side of the border. But and for his family, again, for the Fleming family, it must have been dreadful because they had no word of him, and no one could find him, and his body wasn't found until days later, washed up on the shores of the Banny, drowned. Just, I mean, awful, awful. And as the family were waiting, kind of news of that son, they were then told there's another family tragedy, and one of their others, another member of the family, with another volunteer, they've been both in the city, been out on an operation in the city to shoot dead a part-time member of the UDR at the Granshire Psychiatric Hospital on the by the river, and they on a motorbike, and the operation was, it was information. The security forces had information on it. An SAS team were deployed, and both volunteers were shot dead in effect the car park. I mean, they were covered by, I think 4 or 5 cars full of security forces, and so they were both killed. And again, controversy over, could they have been arrested? Could have been stopped earlier, etc., etc. But arguments are circular in that nature. I mean, the end result is that 2 young men were killed.
What one shot 24 times, right? I was going to say that that shoot to kill thing. I've said it before. It's kind of a misnomer given that when you do shoot at someone, you shoot at center
Shoot.
body mass, which is where your fucking lungs and heart and shit is. Now I think honestly a more accurate term for that whole thing would be an overkill thing, would be
Yeah.
killing where you don't need to kill, or going mad and pumping a fella with nearly 30 bullets. Yeah, just
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I mean, in that circumstance, it is. I don't know what goes through. Like I said, when we talked about it before, and you just mentioned it, John. It's absolutely right. It is about you continue to fire until you perceive that there is no further threat. But you've got to say that 24 rounds. That's the question mark. And I totally get people that say that is proves that there's something not quite right here. So I understand what they're saying.
at the same time, I completely understand from the point of view of like an SAS or some kind of security force guy, where you're like, okay, this is my opportunity, to not put him in prison, but get rid of someone who I perceive to be a terrorist. So I honestly I do I do understand it from that point of view too. That look, we're not gonna treat you with kid gloves. I do understand that perspective. And thank you. We a few more things. Appreciate you sticking around this long. We touched on it earlier. So there's 3 main, at least the ones we know of anyway, 3 main informants related to Derry. There's of course Willie Carlin, there's Ray Gilmour, and there was Franco Hegarty, who was killed after the first Gaddafi arms
Yeah.
shipment. Do you want to go into, yeah, tell us what you like about them and kind of the effect on the brigade.
As we mentioned before, the absolute Achilles heel for Republicans has been the ability of agents and informers, and I would definitely split them. I would definitely split, agents and informers. They're different things to to act against them. So an informer is obviously a member of the organization, and that's the the kind of probably the Franco Hegarty type style. But Raymond Gilmour is yes. So these are individuals who are in the organizations who then turned and provide information, or you get individuals who are specifically in a Harry's game, type way, where they are kind of inserted at the behest of one or other of the intelligence services, in order to act as an agent. Willie Carlin was an agent, so there's a Derry guy who he's a cavalryman in the British Army. He's a tanker based in West Germany, member of the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars, and he's approached by the security services and said, would you leave the army, go back to Derry and become a member of Sinn Féin, and then supply us with information? And so he became Agent 3007. Aaron Edwards, has done, done a great book on him. So I spoke, at length to Willie before he died, and he's the guy in Anson's Crescent with the Joanne Mathers murder, so on. So it's his mum. He'd left by then because it's this strange, smiley type world of Tinker Tailor Soldier, Sinn Féin man, and what have you. In terms of so his handler Michael Bettany is mad. That's the only way I can describe it. He was Oxford University undergraduate who was the only thing people remember about him from his time of Oxford, apparently, was that he had a habit of getting drunk in local pubs and singing the Nazi Party anthem, the Horse Wessel Lied, and everyone would be standing there going, "What in the name of what is this guy doing?" He then and gets recruited by the security services, of course, because that's what you do. Just guy that gets drunk, and his drinking then accelerated, and he became a raging alcoholic. But he was dealing with Carlin, and so Willie Carlin report to him and hand over all his information, and he'd be going, every time I have to meet this guy, I feel like I'm under threat because he's drinking himself like I've never seen anything. He's shooting his mouth off, and I feel personally under threat. And so Carl, it came to a head, and again in a weird, dystopian world, the security service basically retired Carlin and said thank you very much, and they'd moved Bettany to the Soviet desk to combat the KGB. Whereupon he was then caught, with he'd been handing information over to the Soviets in photographs. He then decided he was pro-Soviet, and it's just, you can't make this stuff up. It's just weird as anything. But when Carlin saw Joanne Mathers murdered, he'd been out of the game for a few years, and that he went, right, that's yeah, I was doing the right thing. So he then contacted military intelligence and then went back to work for went to work for them. And of course, kept on passing huge amounts of information, mainly about Martin McGuinness, in what he famously called the Martin McGuinness half hour. So, half hour of every single time he met his handlers, they wanted to know, tell us about McGuinness for 30 minutes, absolutely everything about him. Franco Hegarty, we're starting to get into, well, I'll do Gilmour. So, Gilmour, yeah, the Gilmour's well-known local Catholic family and all that type of thing. Raymond Gilmour, a bit of a tearaway. His best mate was Colin McNutt, who lived 4 doors down, red-haired. Another tearaway who, because of, he used to speak his mother, I think, and maybe do a bit of petty theft as well. The provisionals had tarred and feathered him a couple of times, and Gilmour himself was he got into petty crime, robbed a post office, got beaten up in prison by the provisionals in their kind of Provo justice mode, and this had really turned Gilmour against him. He also, his one of his brothers knew Ranger William Best very well, who the official IRA had abducted and murdered back in '72 before their own ceasefire. And Gilmour had become, he'd really taken a huge dislike to the IRA in general, and the provisionals in particular, and then agreed to work for Special Branch. And at first they set him. I said, right, what we want you to join the INLA, which he did, and he burnt it to the ground in a couple of years because they were nowhere near as professional and structured as the provisionals were, and they were a bit of a mess, and common phrase, shooting from the hip and all this type of thing. And he just destroyed them. The information he passed on, and then he was tasked. Right, now you've done that, join the provisionals, do the same to them. In effect, so he went to them, and yes, that's what he did. And they had him. He was one of the very few professionals with a driving license. Most of them didn't have one, so they put him as a getaway driver, which meant he was involved in every job going, and he just passed immense amounts of information, and mostly frustrating operations. So he'd be told, right, we're going to launch this operation. And he'd say, right, I'll go and get this or whatever, and etc. And then he'd get to a phone box, ring his handler, Pete, not his real name, obviously, ring Pete, and then the operation would be scotched. So either the target wouldn't turn up, or troops would flood the area, or the weapons would get lifted, all making sure that it couldn't all be traced back to Gilmour himself. But he supplied just huge amounts of information. And very rarely, apart from obviously the Chris Shenton shooting, which he didn't have time to, he was private in the Staffordshire Regiment, provisionals put in an ambush, and he didn't have time to warn his handler, and Chris Shenton was killed, which was sort of very controversial, because all of a sudden you've got a state asset being involved in a paramilitary operation that leads to a soldier being killed. Franco Hegarty, this is where things start to get quite murky, because he was in the officials, and then he knew McGuinness well. Then he left years after the ceasefire to say, "Oh no, I've seen the light. I'm going to join the provisionals." Then in double quick time, he gets promoted up the ranks to become the brigade quartermaster. So not just quartermaster of an air shield would know 2-3 hides, caches where weapons, explosives were, and so on, and a few people. But the brigade quartermaster would pretty much know where every weapon was in the city, over the border, and so on. It's a very, very senior position, and it's how, as an individual with a past with a question mark, all of a sudden, and he was turned. He'd been turned earlier about walking his greyhounds. I think it was. He'd been turned by Special Branch, and then betrayed the.
Sorry, I think it was FRU. FRU ran
FRU. Yeah, and I think it was you're absolutely right. Sorry, apologies, John. And then he kind of said, "Oh, we got where the Gaddafi weapons are for the first shipment in," and told his partner the night before the raids went in on across the border in the Republic, and then had to go on the run, and taken over to England, and like so many others before and since, missed home in this because if you kind of look at it in an objective way, you'd say you're lucky to be alive, and there is no way that you're going to the organization yourself, and they don't take lightly to this sort of stuff. So you're going to stay a million miles away from it and start a new life. And yet, for some reason, they just get, what's Al Pacino's line? I thought I was out, but they sucked me back in. I mean, he does it so much better, obviously. And but that's it. And so he's persuaded, and partly he's persuaded to go back by reassurances from Martin McGuinness himself, to say we just need to his mother, to say we just need to debrief and find out what he said, and then everything will be fine. And of course, it wasn't. So he went back, was picked up, and then was killed.
If anyone might be like newer to the channel or anything, there's a really good book called Four Shots in the Night by a fellow called Henry Hemming. Really skillful writer. He wrote it like magnificently. But we did an entire episode on
Yes,
Frank
we did.
Hegarty and his killing and so on. Yeah, yeah. If anyone wants to go back and see that. Okay, so there was obviously I'm sure there were more informers and there were many there's many who would suspect Martin McGuinness of having worked with security forces or been informing over the years. It's that type of thing. I'm kind of wary myself. It's the sort of thing that you can like speak the perception into reality if you kind of keep going on about it. Asking now, in fairness, I think there's more than enough. We'll call it like circumstantial evidence to warrant seriously examine whether Martin McGuinness informed or worked. But in fairness, there is more than enough. It's not just rumor and stuff.
Thought about it an awful lot, doing the research and writing the book, and I kept an open mind, very, very firmly. And I have to be absolutely clear. I have not seen any written evidence or otherwise that says that Martin McGuinness was in any way working with the British. I have not seen a single word on a single piece of paper that even alludes to that in any way. And I think you would have to see that. I mean, I'm a historian. I would have to have incontrovertible cross-referenced evidence to say definitively this is the truth, and I haven't seen it, and so on. And but at the same time, and I make this point in the book. There's always going to be rumor, and accusations and so on, particularly about leading figures of an organization by necessity has to operate in the shadows in order to survive. But what struck me, and I did have to mention it in the book, was yes, I interviewed a former senior volunteer, with who I cross-checked and referenced to make sure that their bona fides were as they said, who knew him very well personally and worked with him over very many years. And he was the one, and I quote him obviously verbatim in the book. He said he was sure that he was, but at the same time, I said, look, if you want me to take this, and he's an alias in the book, and I said, go on the record, and let me quote you by name, because that's at least something. That's at least some. It's still not proof. It's a supposition, but at least it's an individual putting their. And he said no, and I understand why he said no. I mean, I completely get it, but that just so there's gonna. I would think that there's the yeah. But at the same time, like you said, I think it is a discussion where that should be had, and individual, because there, like I said, there is enough out there. I spoke to a former 14 intelligence company officer, who spent his entire career over there covering Derry, and he said, he never understood why just they didn't do more on Martin McGuinness. He said everyone knew he was the top guy. He'd been the top guy for ages. And he goes, but we were never tasked, hardly ever, to have anything to do with him. They didn't tell us to stay away from him. But equally, we never got any taskings that said, right, we want this on McGuinness, follow him, do this. I said that was my working assumption when I was detailed up there, that our number one target would be Martin McGuinness. And he goes, no, wasn't at all. In fact, almost every operation that we ran against him on the surveillance side, we did off our own bat, and so on. So it was not centrally directed at all. And he found that, and there's lots of bits, if I can put it like that, lots of just hints. So, I would never, and I'm very clear about that in the book. I didn't want, I didn't want the book to be about Bloody Sunday. I didn't want the book to be was Martin McGuinness in any way supplying information to the security services or security forces and so on, because otherwise it gets kind of lost down rabbit holes of conspiracy theories, and he ends up being on the grassy knoll with JFK. It's all. I didn't want to go down there. but at the same time, I think there's definitely enough. I mean, my personal view is I definitely do not think he was a British agent like Willie Carlin or whatever. He wasn't that. He was not inserted into the organisation anyway. Um, I don't equally think that he was informer. That he was approached by Special Branch over a period of time, turned because they found out, he drank too much, gambled too much, or the classics of using that type of thing, or he was just given potloads of money and so on to hand over information. I would think that if anything at all, and it is total supposition, is that he, on very few occasions, used the security services, some branch of it, to to the furtherance of his own cause. Supplying them with the odd bit of information that suited him at the time. I think that was, that's probably the fullest extent that I would go. But then I wouldn't be surprised if that's not true at all either. I mean, as I say in the book, the man was a complete enigma. Complete enigma. I never met him, so I've no idea what he was like personally. But a fascinating character without a doubt. And it's just the fact that again, I make the point in the book. Every single other unit of any significance in the provisionals was headed up by lots of different people. There was just that's even South Armagh. There was movement of that, but Derry Brigade was Martin McGuinness really from beginning of his involvement, whether he was the official officer commanding or not. He really did, and no other IRA unit was even close to that.
Yeah, yeah. In fairness, I have to admit there was a documentary about a documentary that came out in recent years called The Secret Army. The original thing is called The Secret Army. I think it's from 72, if not it's early 70s, but it does contain like very, 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 very clear footage of Martin McGuinness
Yeah,
as a young man loading
yeah.
up.
Look, he doesn't touch it. It's Jay Bell, the American TV guy, and he wrote a book about it. Yes, I almost was tempted to use one of the photos, and of course, the famous one is he's directing the loading of a car bomb into the boot of a car before it goes off, and then blows off, and it's perfectly obvious about who he is, and he never sought to hide it. I mean, the classic one, he's the reason he spent 6 months in the Curragh, well, a bit more in the was that he admitted to membership of the IRA in a court, and said, "I am very proud that I am a member." And of course, everyone draws the comparison between him and our friend Jerry, who says, "I was never in the IRA. No idea what you're talking about. I was a shop assistant in Lidl at the time, or whatever he says." So yes, so it's a huge difference.
Okay, so yeah, as like a second last topic almost. There was in the 90s there was not quite a bit, but there was UDA activity and killing in Derry. This kind of matches somewhat with East Tyrone, where there wasn't really loyalist paramilitary activity to speak of before, but then later on, as they became a bit weaker, and for other reasons, there was. I'm thinking that I guess in East Tyrone, it was the UVF though. They took
Yeah.
out, including when Billy Wright, I believe it was in Kappa, um, uh,
Oh, yeah.
the bar Brian Arthur's cousin of Lockall's Declan Arthur's being the target there. So yeah, it does kind of reflect in both. Yeah, tell us a bit about the UDA killings and their response then.
This was true. So UVF really had nothing in that part of Northern Ireland. Yeah, their strength was obviously Belfast and Mid Ulster. So up there it was UDA. They didn't have the organisation really that they had, for instance, in Belfast. But, following Anglo-Irish agreement, following the rise of Sinn Féin, so Republicans then start to become put on election posters and et cetera, et cetera. So they're starting to become figures and well known, and the UDA then began to target them, and that you see that against the whole province wide at that time. There's a rise in the kind of late 80s, early 90s in their activity, and there's a mix, as there always is, with the Protestant paramilitaries, of just awful slaughter. So the likes of Grey Steel and so on, where I know what, let's go and machine gun a bar, of people, and etc. Nakedly sectarian, just vile.
Even shouted trick or treat, and I think a witness saw like laughing and smiling. That's another level of depravity. Like,
Oh, exactly, and most of that goes rightly. Then went to prison for life, unfortunately, under the auspices of the Good Friday Agreement. There, yeah, but anyway, then targeted attacks. A lot of them against Sinn Féin political activists, former prisoners. Probably the most infamous was Eddie Fullerton, who was over the border in Donegal. He was a Donegal councillor, and a UDA hit team went across the border. And there's some rubbish talked about, that they did a bit of a James Bond thing and went across the lock in a speedboat and then back, and it's all absolute rubbish and so on. Is they went over, they hijacked a car over there. I think it was a Skoda, and of course Skoda in those days, it was all the jokes. How do you double the price of a Skoda? Fill it with fuel. That sort of thing. These things, it's not like Skoda now is run by the Germans and everything works. Back then, it was absolutely terrible. So they hijacked, and on the way out, it broke down. They ended up pushing the thing, and so on. So not exactly James Bond, but they went over, and this guy, he's unarmed. He's asleep at home after a long day electioneering. They break into his home. He comes out onto the landing to see what the heck's going on, and they just shoot him dead on the landing with his wife in the bed. I mean, it's just it's just cold-blooded murder. And there was quite a few of those activities. I mean, there were there's other ones, such as there's the Castle Rock killings. So Castle Rock, which is a beautiful small town on the coast, looking at, I mean, it's a lovely place. And there was a team of workers renovating a house there and so on. All of them completely innocent Catholics, apart from one who was a leading member of South Derry PIRA, but just there doing the job on the day, and a UDA gun team machine gunned a lot of them. One luckily survived. God knows how he did. Yes, they killed the provisional volunteer, but they also, I think it was another 4 innocent workers that were killed, and it was much the same team who'd done Grey Steel. So that they were never the force, the kind of the anti-provisional force that the UVF was in Mid Ulster, in East Tyrone. But they definitely kind of accelerated their killing, and they killed quite a few others, and so on. All of their kind of places of work and whatever, former Sinn Féin activists, former provisional prisoners, and so on, until it all finally, thank goodness, came to a close.
right, yeah, I was gonna say the Derry, thankfully all violence from the Republicans, it went way down. Obviously, the latter half of the 80s, and more so in the 90s. Peace talks were kind of well underway and stuff. So yeah, Do you want to talk? Yeah, just kind of wrap it up as to, like, kind of how it did wrap up.
Derry was one of those things, because they weren't. South Derry, as I said, had never been the same since the Wanted trio had gone, but they were still around. They were still active. The city, again, Gilmour in particular, had gutted them, absolutely gutted them. I mean, after he skedaddled, after he was about to get, thought he was going to get blown, so he was taken out of the city. There was the classics. They put all the graffiti on the wall saying, know Raymond Ray Gilmour. Thank F he didn't know me, type of thing. And it did. And a lot of most of those individuals were later then freed, but they were on remand, held in custody for a long time. And the brigade just kind of collapsed in many ways. With individuals got out, they either then went over the border, they left the movement, or whatever. And also the political mood was changing because the big one was McGuinness. He'd been their boss, their driver, their inspiration for decades, and now he was shuttling to and from Belfast. And that's where people saw him. He'd come home and he'd see his wife and family. He was a very family orientated individual, and then he'd get in the car and shoot to Belfast to see Jerry and to move everything on. And that was where his focus was. And if you're heading that, the person who has led your organization almost since it's in its creation as another priority, it goes wayward. Where's the where's the drive? Where's the push? And it just disappeared in many ways. And in that instance, it just ran out of puff, if I can put it like that. And there were still volunteers there. There were still a lot of people willing to do operations and what have you. And there was weaponry, although as with all the brigades, much of the Gaddafi weaponry was not forthcoming to the ASU. Some was, without a doubt, but not the tsunami of weapons that either the volunteers wanted or the security forces expected. That was again one of the things that came out with the interviews with the security force, agency individuals and special branch and so on, is that they were briefed and ready for just a mountain of weapons to come flying in, and it just never appeared. And they were kind of scratching their heads, going, "Where the hell is it?" And it was in dumps, never used. And so in that atmosphere, it just wound down over time, and it never kind of fully stopped. There were operations here, there, and so on, but the pace of operations had disappeared, and really, and again, this is I'm sure the wrong articulation, so I do apologize, but it was almost they're fulfilling a role, like in a play, doing, we'll do what enough to make it feel like we're functioning, but heart's not really in it. And of course, ceasefire comes and then that's it. And they don't have the breakaway, like happened in other parts of the Northern Ireland. You don't have a big Derry real IRA piece or so on. They were pretty, they're pretty united in terms of this is actually the way we're going. And in a way, you think not surprised because, of course, McGuinness was part and parcel of that with Adams, so he's not going to allow the brigade that he has led for all that time to do anything other than follow his lead. And now the city. I mean, I've seen the city in my trips over there, and it's a world different from go around comparing pictures from the 60s and early 70s of just slums, and you're thinking, how could people, they're subjected to this, and it is a world away, and yeah, thank goodness it is. It's yeah, and long may it continue. But I mean, I hope that was useful, John. But yeah,
Oh, absolutely brilliant. I was going to say, yeah, on McGuinness, he would later at one stage, I'm going to politics, obviously. I remember, I think my first kind of real introduction to him, other than like looking at a picture of him in like my dad's books and stuff, because I hadn't really read about the troubles up until then, but in 2011, the year before my leaving, so I was 17, but he ran for president in Ireland. Just to mention for anyone not from
yeah,
Ireland, president isn't like president in America, or it's not like prime minister or Taoiseach. It's a very very different role. But I even remember thinking like how fucking bizarre it is that even though this fella like Martin McGuinness is very much an instrumental part of the peace process and all that, but Jesus Christ, he was still a paramilitary leader. It's just I remember thinking it's crazy, and there was this one bit in one of the debates. McGuinness ended up finishing third, and the fellow who finished above him was this ex or not ex, but this entrepreneur fella. Do you not show Dragon's Den?
Yeah, yeah.
The Irish version of that. There was a guy on it called Sean Gallagher. And on stage, McGuinness like basically like slit his throat because he dropped this bombshell on him about having like it was like taking money or holding money for something, but it was like dodgy dealings. And McGuinness like dropped it on him on stage, and Christ above it was like a political execution. He still managed to finish above him, but yeah, that I remember, and I remember thinking, I swear to God, I remember seeing in McGuinness's eyes there was like there was like a kind of a seriousness and a coldness that even amongst like the hardest, most Machiavellian politicians wasn't quite there. I just remember seeing that there was something very, very different in this man's eyes. So yeah, he ran for president. Do you remember where you were when you heard he died?
To be honest, I went to his grave uh, on one of the trips and so on. And now I, mean, I was always shocked because it came out of nowhere. It came absolutely out of nowhere. And then there was the family, totally understandably, wouldn't talk about how he died. So it wasn't, I didn't say long drawn out illness, lung cancer or whatever. There was just, and I was shocked because I was thinking, I'd never known. It's like if Jerry Adams died. I'd never known a time when they weren't around. And he was always, you're absolutely right. There was, the two of them again. It's a juxtaposition. There's Jerry Adams smoking his pipe and his glasses, and with his huge bushy beard, trying to be all a bit homely, and the uncle. Whereas McGuinness never went. McGuinness was just clipped hard. This is what I obviously interviewed lots of volunteers. I interviewed one who knew him very, very well, who just and he said he used words. He goes, he would forget whatever thing about this in the latter years when he's the Chuckle Brothers with Ian Paisley. He said he was the most ruthless man I have ever known. He said he just was. So all the rest of it is just yeah stuff. He was cold as.
I remember I hadn't been living here too long. And at the time on the weekend, I was working in a nightclub that was attached to a restaurant. So when the restaurant, when we were kind of starting our setup, the restaurant was kind of wrapping up. And literally one of the only fellas from the north, I think he's from Belfast, but I could be wrong, was a chef in there. And I walked in, and he just looks up and goes, "Did you hear about Marty?" And straight away it didn't. I was like, it obviously it didn't mean Martin McGuinness because he wasn't in
Yeah,
the news or he wasn't. I was like, do we work with a fellow named Martin? I was like, who? And he said,
yeah,
oh, Martin McGuinness died. And my first thought was, oh, he must have been killed because
yeah,
he's not that old or anything. But
yeah.
no, but no, he wasn't. But it was one of them moments. I swear to God, when you get a piece of news and you're like your eyes take a screenshot. I can remember exactly the exact kind of
Well,
the exact view I had. But yeah, that was funny, and that was before I started this podcast, obviously, and it was even before my interest in the troubles, we'll say, got going. Which in fairness was Say Nothing. That book actually, yeah, just because of how captivating it was and the way it told like people's stories, which is what I want to do here. Yeah. Sorry, on that note. Did you see the TV series Say Nothing? I haven't done anything about it yet.
so we watched it. And it was my wife Rachel, who I think it's fair to say doesn't really kind of go in for this sort of thing, because she's normal, unlike you and I, and so on. And she said, "Oh, why don't we give this a go?" And I'm like going, "Seriously, are you?" Because I'd love to see it, but I mean, she was like, "Yeah," and then she was hooked, as was I. And it's, I mean, it's very well done. I mean, it's very controversial. Um, and I've obviously I've met Anthony McIntyre, and so on, and spoken to him. So of course, and I've done that. So I was able to name drop with my wife. So we're sitting on the sofa, and it's like going, oh, Macca's, and I'm like going, oh, Macca's, yeah, I've met Macca's. I won't call him Macca's to his face because he gets very animated about it, doesn't like that, unless he lets you. But and she was like, going, seriously, you've met that guy. And I was like going, oh yeah, we've chatted, had tea, that sort of stuff. But it's yes, it makes it very personal. And my wife, and the funny thing, she watched it, and the character she liked most was the Dark, Brendan Hughes. She thought, oh my god, he's really nice. I really like. I said, oh, the guy that's shooting people. Yeah, but equally, I thought he came across absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's one of I'd have loved to have met him and interviewed, Brendan Hughes before he passed. But it's one of those things. But yeah, I thought it's really really well done.
Yeah. He
Um,
was, for
yeah,
anyone who hasn't seen it, Brendan Hughes was portrayed in his youth, and then after in his youth,
yeah.
he was played by a guy called Anthony Boyle, was done really well, and then an actor who I knew from an Irish TV series called Love Hate, a guy called Tom Vaughan Lawler. He played older Brendan Hughes. I found that show, yeah, I did. Overall, I did enjoy it quite a bit. It's 9 episodes, 8 or 9 episodes. The first half, because it kind of is a book of two halves. It's about the the stuff kind of early 70s that happened, and then it's about like people's memory of it and people's reckoning with it and so on. So the first 4 or 5 episodes make for like much more entertaining television because it's like the action and the shit happening and stuff. I wish they had done this would have added, I'm sure, a lot of cost to the show. But one of the things I liked so much about the book is that obviously you have your main characters, Brendan, Jerry, the Price sisters, McConville, and it follows them. But the book described in Patrick Radden Keefe's like really, really, really excellent style. It described like certain events, like the Magnificent Seven breakout and Gibraltar, Milltown, and the subsequent corpus thing. And yeah, I was really looking forward to see how they were going to do them in the show, but they didn't. Because yeah, it wasn't like it probably wasn't the stuff you kind of had to have in the show. But yeah, it was really good. I hope of all these books, whose authors I've interviewed in the last year or two, some of them would make for amazing films or one series TV shows. We even said about the East Tyrone. I could see Death in the Fields being a brilliant like 8 or 9 parter TV series.
I mean, we mentioned it before. You're absolutely right, John. I mean, and I know you put out a play on the podcast, say for any of them, for producers out there or direct or TV, film or whatever. And you're absolutely right. I'd love to. I think that, and something like Say Nothing shows there is an audience for it. It's not a case of five blokes and a hamster will be the only ones who be interested. It isn't. If there is a great story and it's told well, and it's and the quality, the film quality and all that type of thing, the production quality is good. You can really there is something something absolutely there. And I look at it and go, why is there not more stuff being done on this? It's and I hope that something like Say Nothing is a kind of a spur to the suits in boardrooms to turn around and say, oh, there's yeah, we can get some audience with this and etc. And it doesn't have to be the most expensive thing in the world. Like we don't have to build spaceships or all this type of stuff. So yeah, I would absolutely join with you and say I wish that there'd be a if you're in TV, film, producing, directing, whatever, you should get in touch with your good self. And let's look at something. And if it comes to nothing, doesn't come to anything, not the end of the world. But yeah, there's some great stories here that deserve to be told, and there's clearly a big audience demand for.
Yeah, I'm always very kind of careful as to like how I frame it. I don't want that. These are people's lives and their relatives and so on.
Of course,
It's not just it's not just cool material for a bloody film script or
no,
something. But yeah, there is that aspect. And in fairness, it's kind of maybe a bit of an ugly truth, but like in order for people to even find out about this historical topic and then to get into it in today's world, I think a lot of the time it does require a TV show or a movie because people don't. I think people don't read as much, and there's a bajillion options on Netflix and all the rest. So yeah, it's very
Agreed.
competitive too. Okay, yeah, just to wrap up, this was your second book, obviously. Really enjoyable. The book will be out by the time we put this episode out, so it'll be available. We'll have a link in the description. Tell us about your next work.
This one comes out at the end of April, early May, and then it's for me. I really want to tackle the big one, if I can call it that. So that's the Belfast Brigade, and it's I've been thinking about this a long time. It's too much for one book. It just is. I'm going to do it in two volumes. Um, First one will in effect cover the kind of beginning of the Troubles, and I'm thinking at the moment, I've still not finalised it, but it's going to go up to the beginning of the hunger strike of Bobby Sands. So it'll end with Bobby Sands refusing food, and then the second book will move on from that until till the end of the Troubles. And even then, I think I'm going to struggle to cover the topic in any way. I would absolutely encourage anyone who wants to talk to me about it, contribute or whatever, to get in touch. Obviously, through yourself, John, or through my own website. Go onto my website and there's a contact me. But and as per last time, after we did the Death in the Fields on East Tyrone, I was honestly my inbox was stuffed with so many people want to get, and it's been brilliant, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to those individuals, and they've been incredibly helpful, and so on, even when sometimes they've been less than complimentary to start with. I think that's fair to say, but yeah. So please get in touch, and that's what I'll be doing for unfortunately for my wife for the next few years, I think. So, but yeah, it's thanks again for having me on. Brilliant podcast. And so I can, I know the kind of the reach that you get, because I get on my website I get the kind of the who views, the unique view site and all that type of stuff, and then it's like a almost a dead person. So every month it basically just exactly the same goes, duh, and then your podcast it goes duh, duh, shoots up, and then almost dies again forever. So clearly, I mean, you do have a great audience who are very knowledgeable, know their stuff, and yeah, I'd love to speak to anyone if they want to get in touch.
Absolutely. If there's anyone out there who, yeah, get in contact, if you want to get in contact with John through me, or if I'll put it this way, right? Like the way I would say it, if you're someone who was involved with whatever was saying, and if you think that if you and me met and we just got chatting, chatting in a bar or something, and if I was to ask you, if you think you'd say yes, then please get in contact because I can't ask you. I can't ask you if I don't know kind of who you are. I always talk with guests before we go over like kind of what you're comfortable going into, what like legally you can and can't. There's all that. Yeah, don't worry about that. It's not just straight into an interview. There's talking stuff before. On the thing about reach, sorry, I forgot to say this. Every single week, on YouTube, you get like a weekly and monthly report about what videos people are watching and how long and blah blah blah. Every single week since the East Tyrone episode, it's always in the top three, always in the top three. Even back when I was, apologies to viewers, I've been really slow lately. I used to be having like one a week, and now it hasn't been. Although I do have a few lined up. So yeah, always in the top three. I wanted to mention this just in terms of Derry. So I get way more views on YouTube. It just kind of caught more on YouTube than podcast. But on podcast, you also get a report of like where people watch from and all that. And every every single week or every single episode rather, it's pretty much the same. It goes Dublin, Belfast, Glasgow. Magherafeld, and then goes back to cities. Then it goes to like Birmingham or wherever. I swear I get more downloads. Not on YouTube, but on podcast. I get more downloads from Magherafeld than Cork. Than the largest county in the country. Again, thanks a million for coming, for staying over 3 hours. Really nice, long, meaty, juicy episode for people to sink their teeth into. So thanks again. Anything you wanted to mention before you go?
That's again, just thanks, John. I mean, really, because it's just you just make it so easy to do because you know the subject matter, uh, uh, so well, and you're very good. You're pleasure to work with.
Much appreciated. That means an awful lot. Thank you very much, and I can't wait. I can't wait until Belfast book gets done. We can do a nice another long one on that.
Brilliant. Thanks again, John. We'll speak again soon.